8. The rights view. In this chapter, the case for recognizing the rights of moral agents and patients is brought to a head. The statement and defense of the rights view requires making use of the conclusions reached in the preceding, but it also involves exploring ideas conspicuous for their absence to this point, most notably the idea of rights. I shall proceed as follows. Moral and legal rights will be distinguished. The former are analyzed in terms of valid claims that have correlative duties. Since the respect principle sets forth an unacquired duty of justice, calling for the respectful treatment of all who have inherent value, it is argued that those who have this kind of value have a valid claim and thus a right to treatment respectful of their value. Because both moral agents and patients have value of this kind and have it equally, both are shown to have an equal moral right to treatment respectful of their value. A number of objections against the arguments of the first 5 sections are then considered, and in the next section, 2 principles that imply that all or some of those individuals who have inherent value may never justifiably be harmed are explored and found to be deficient. A further objection, one that contests the meaningfulness of regarding moral patients as innocent, is disputed, and a final objection, raised against the permissibility of counting the number of innocent individuals to determine what ought to be done, is refuted. Having thus prepared the way for recognizing the equal prima facie moral right of moral agents and patients not to be harmed, the next section turns to the task of identifying and validating those principles that justify overriding this right. The radical difference between the rights view and utilitarianism is then explained, and a number of objections to and implications of the rights view are considered. Before the final section's summary and conclusion, 2 issues broached but not resolved in earlier chapters are considered. 8.1. Moral and legal rights. Whether individuals have legal rights depends on the laws and other legal background, for example, the Constitution, of the society in which they live. In some countries, for example, the United States, citizens meeting certain requirements have the legal right to vote or run for elected office. In other countries, for example, Libya, citizens do not have these rights. Moreover, even in those countries that give this right to its citizens, the requirements are not always the same and are subject to change. In the United States, for example, citizens once had to be 21 years of age to vote in federal elections. Now they must be 18. At one time, one could not vote if one were black or female or illiterate. Now one has this right regardless of race or sex or educational achievement. Legal rights, thus, are subject to great variation, not only among different countries at the same time, but also in the same country at different times. When it comes to legal rights, not all individuals are equal. This should not be surprising. The legal rights of individuals have arisen as the result of the creative activity of human beings. Those rights set forth in the Bill of Rights, for example, were not rights that citizens of the United States could claim as legal rights before these rights were drawn up and the legal machinery necessary for their enforcement was in place. The concept of moral rights differs in important ways from that of legal rights. First, moral rights, if there are any, are universal. This means that if any individual, A, has such a right, then any other individual like A in the relevant respects also has this right. What counts as the relevant respects is controversial, something we will have to come to terms with in what follows. What is not controversial is the exclusion of some characteristics as relevant. An individual's race, sex, religion, place of birth, or country of domicile are not relevant characteristics for the possession of moral rights. We cannot deny that individuals possess moral rights, as we can in the case of the possession of legal rights, because of, for example, where they live. A second feature of moral rights is that they are equal. This means that if any 2 individuals have the same moral right, for example, the right to liberty, then they have this right equally. Possession of moral rights does not come in degrees. All who possess them equally, whether they are, say, white or black, male or female, Americans or Iranians. Third, moral rights, unlike legal rights, do not arise as a result of the creative acts of any one individual, for example, a despot, or any group, for example, a legislative assembly. Theoretically, one could, it is true, create legal rights that accord with or protect moral rights, but that is not the same as creating these moral rights in the first place. If there are moral rights, they do not come to be in the way legal rights do. Few issues divide philosophers as deeply as the debate over moral rights. When, for example, Singer expresses his regrets over referring to rights in the course of his argument for animal liberation, what he says is illustrative of the tendency on the part of some thinkers to disparage appeals to rights in moral philosophy, appeals that are, in the words of the 19th century English philosopher D.G. Ritchie, a rhetorical device for gaining a point without the trouble of proving it. A device that, Ritchie goes on to observe, may be left to the stump orator or party journalist, but which should be discredited in all serious writing. An even more caustic accusation about the use of the rhetoric of rights is offered by Hare, who laments the frequency with which people ask the question, "What rights do I have?" For people who ask this question, he writes, will, being human, nearly always answer that they have those rights, whatever they are, which will promote a distribution of goods which is in the interest of their own social group. The rhetoric of rights, which is engendered by this question, is a recipe for class war and civil war. In pursuit of these rights, people will, because they have convinced themselves that justice demands it, inflict almost any harms on the rest of society and on themselves. Worse than being a mere rhetorical device, appeals to and beliefs about rights on Hare's view can be positively harmful. It is no accident that Hare and Singer, for example, who we know are advocates of utilitarianism, should disassociate themselves from reliance on moral rights. In doing so, they follow in Bentham's well-known footsteps. Rights are, he writes, the fruits of the law and of the law alone. There are no rights without law. No rights contrary to the law, no rights anterior to the law. There are no other than legal rights. No natural rights, no rights of man, anterior or superior to those created by the laws. The assertion of such rights, absurd in logic, is pernicious in morals. Worse than nonsense, Bentham actually characterizes talk of rights other than legal rights as nonsense upon stilts. Invocations of the rights of man are dangerous nonsense. How much the repudiation of moral rights by these utilitarians is itself a rhetorical device may be left to the reader to decide. It is relevant to note that not all utilitarians have been theoretically ill-disposed to moral rights. Mill provides a clear counter-instance to the prevailing utilitarian tendency, believing that utilitarian theory is adequate to the task of accommodating moral rights. Whether he is correct in thinking this is a matter I will postpone examining at this juncture. Here it will be useful to review what he says about rights and contrast this with Bentham's view. Moreover, by endorsing, as I shall, the analysis Mill gives of moral rights, the way will be blocked to the objection that I rely on an analysis for which no utilitarian can have any sympathy. The strategy is to play to the strength of those utilitarians who acknowledge moral rights rather than to play to their weakness. When we call anything a person's right, Mill writes, we mean that he has a valid claim upon society to protect him in the possession of it, either by the force of law or by that of education or opinion. If he has what we consider to be a sufficient claim, on whatever account, to have something guaranteed him by society, we say he has a right to it. To have a right, then, is, I conceive, to have something society ought to defend me in the possession of. Unlike Bentham's view of rights, Mills does not restrict rights to those that are recognized by the existing laws of a given society and suitably enforced. It is quite possible, given Mill's analysis of rights, for someone to have a valid claim on something, and thus a right to it, and yet for society not to recognize the validity of this claim, and thus to fail to protect the individual in his possession of it. While on Bentham's view there can be no rights except those recognized by law, that is, legal rights, on Mill's view there can be socially unacknowledged and legally unenforced rights, that is, moral rights. And this is a virtue of Mill's position. One of the roles appeals to rights play, as the American philosopher David Lyons notes, is their use to argue for changes in the social order. Bentham's analysis of rights makes this literally meaningless, that is, nonsense, since where there is no socially acknowledged and enforced right, that is, no legal right, there can be no right, period. Mill's analysis allows for the meaningfulness of appeals to rights in such cases, while implying that such appeals are not self-authenticating. Just because we claim to have a right to so-and-so, it does not follow that our claim is a valid one, nor, therefore, that we have the right in question. If the validity of the claim is not shown, or worse still, if we fail seriously even to address the task of showing its validity, then Ritchie's remark is apt. Our appeal to our rights is a rhetorical device, a device we use for gaining a point without the trouble of proving it. There is no reason why this must be so, however, or why, because some, perhaps even most, appeals to rights are rhetorical, in the sense Singer and Hare bemoan, all appeals to rights should be summarily dismissed. Mill, for all his insistence on utility as the sole moral basis of morality, is not ill-disposed to all appeals to moral rights. That is an example of theoretical tolerance we might all do well to emulate. Two further features of Mill's analysis of moral rights warrant comment. First, moral rights, understood as valid claims, have correlative duties. If I have the right to liberty, for example, then you and society generally have a duty, in Mill's words, to protect me in the possession of it. My liberty is something society ought to defend me in the possession of. Recognition of my moral rights, therefore, carries implications concerning both what you, as a moral agent, must and must not do. What you must not do is violate my rights, and what you must do, other things being equal, is protect me against any others who would violate them. Your recognition of my moral rights thus both imposes certain limits on your liberty and grounds obligations of assistance you have to me. It is because the moral rights individuals have carry these implications that recognition of these rights is the serious business it is. Indiscriminate invocation of our rights can cheapen the notion as it irritates those who are called upon to bear the burdens of duties of assistance and forbearance if the rights are recognized. Second, to characterize moral rights as Mill does, as valid claims, leaves it an open question how these claims are to be validated. Bentham's disenchantment with the idea of moral rights can be partly explained by his impatience with the method of validation some have favored. For example, that moral, natural, rights are conferred by nature itself, or that they are self-evident, or, relatedly, that they are there to be discovered by the pure light of natural reason. One can agree that these are unreliable procedures for validating rights and still allow that rights can be validated, that is, that good reasons can be given to recognize some claims to rights as valid claims. Mill once again provides us with guidance concerning how this may be done. The validity of a right, he believes, must depend on its compliance with moral principles, whose validity have been independently established. In Mill's case, the validating moral principle is that of utility. It should not be surprising, therefore, that he should write as follows. To have a right, then, is, I conceive, to have something society ought to defend me in the possession of. If the objector goes on to ask why it ought, I can give him no other reason than general utility. There is, however, nothing in Mill's analysis of rights as valid claims that logically ties validation of these claims to the utility of recognizing them. As Lyons remarks, someone who rejected the general welfare standard could consistently accept Mill's analysis of rights, or something like it, and use a different basis for validating the relevant claims. This is because his analysis of rights is independent of the general welfare standard. What moral principles validate rights, in other words, is left open by Mill's analysis of what rights are. An alternative to Mill's utilitarian validation will be offered in 8.4. 8.2. Claims and valid claims. The view that moral rights are valid claims has a high degree of initial plausibility. To have a right is to be in a position to claim, or to have claimed on one's behalf, that something is due or owed, and the claim that is made is a claim made against somebody to do or forbear what is claimed as due. Mill has little to say about the nature of claims. The distinguished American philosopher Joel Feinberg does. Like Mill, Feinberg analyzes rights as claims that are validated, called for, by reference to valid moral principles, or the principles of an enlightened conscience. Unlike Mill, Feinberg explores the notion of a claim at length, distinguishing between 1. Making a claim, 2. Having a valid claim to, 3. Having a valid claim against, and 4. Having a valid claim all considered. Only in the last case does one have a right, on his analysis, yet the other considerations have a role to play in explicating both what rights are and how they are to be validated. How these several ideas are related may be explained as follows. To make a claim is a performance. It is to assert that one is oneself entitled, or that someone else is entitled, to treatment of a certain kind, and that the treatment is due or owed directly to the individuals in question. To make a claim thus involves both claims to and claims against. It involves claims against a given individual, or many individuals, to do or forbear what is claimed is due, and it involves a claim to what one is claiming is owed. Both these features of making a claim are crucial to the process of validating a claim that has been made. I cannot have a valid claim, that is, a right, if I do not have a valid claim against someone, and I cannot have a valid claim against someone if that individual does not have a duty to me to do or forbear doing the act I claim is owed me. This is why no one has a valid claim, that is, a right, to the charitable acts of others. Duties of charity allow considerable individual discretion concerning how they may be discharged. I might give my money to Oxfam and Sisters of the Poor. You might give yours to CARE and the Sierra Club, and we both might thereby fulfill our duty of charity, more or less. But though we have a duty to be charitable organizations themselves have no right to our contributions, and they have no right to this because they have no valid claim against us in this regard. A representative of the United Way, for example, has no valid grounds on which to argue that we have a duty of charity to contribute money to that organization in particular. And since neither the United Way nor any other charitable organization has a valid claim against us in this respect, no such organization has a right to our charitable acts. For similar reasons, we have no rights with respect to the natural order. Individuals are every day affected, for good or ill, by what happens as a result of nature's running its course. But no one can reasonably complain that nature violates his or her rights. Nature could violate our rights only if we could validate our claims against it, and we could validate our claims against it only if we could make the case that nature has direct duties to us, to do or forbear doing certain acts that are our due. But nature has no duties, only moral agents do. When we, as we sometimes do, speak of nature or its consequences as unjust or unfair, we speak metaphorically. What happens as a result of natural laws happens. It is neither just nor unjust, fair nor unfair, though it can be and frequently is beneficial or harmful. Nature no more violates our rights than it respects them. The claims to feature of making and validating claims also is important. To make a claim is to assert that treatment is due. Whether the treatment claimed as due is due depends in part on whether it is within the powers and capacities of those against whom the claim is made to forbear doing what is claimed as due. It is no good your claiming to be owed a vacation in Acapulco or a retreat in Vail from me. To make claims to something against someone cannot be valid if they cannot be satisfied. To fully validate a claim, that is, to establish a right, therefore clearly involves more than making a claim. The claim that is made must be validated both as a claim to and as a claim against. To satisfy the former requirement, one must show that the treatment claimed as due makes requirements of those against whom the claim is made that they can meet. To satisfy the latter requirement, one must show that the treatment claimed as due is owed by those individuals against whom the claim is made. Now, to meet this latter requirement will involve appeals to valid moral principles that set forth direct duties. This should come as no surprise, since to make a claim to something against others is to assert that they are required to act in certain ways. One must show that this treatment is owed or is due, and to show this, one must show that the treatment in question is required by valid moral principles of direct duty. This is why moral rights have correlative moral duties. If I have a right to, say, life and liberty, then others have direct duties to me with respect to these rights. It is only when claims to and claims against are coupled with appeals to appropriate, valid moral principles that we have a valid claim, all considered, that is, a moral right. It is because many claims to rights are not validated in this way that appeals to rights have gotten a bad name. But again, just because this is sometimes, even frequently true, there is no reason why this must be true of all appeals to rights. To establish one's rights is not by itself enough to establish anyone's duty in any actual situation. This is clearest in cases where rights themselves come into conflict. I may have a right to free speech, for example, but it does not follow that others have a duty in each and every circumstance to allow me to say anything I please. Others have rights too, and what I do in the name of my right to free speech might conflict with their rights, as when, in the proverbial case, I shout "fire" when there is none in a crowded theater. To establish one's rights is to establish their moral relevance in the determination of what, in any actual case, morally ought to be done. Whatever ought to be done, in other words, cannot be determined independently of considering the rights of those involved, even though what ought to be done cannot be determined just by citing this or that right possessed by this or that individual. 8.3. Acquired and unacquired duties. The merits of the analysis of rights in terms of valid claims might be clearer if we apply it to both acquired and unacquired duties. Unacquired duties, what Rawls calls natural duties, to use Rawls's characterization, apply to us without regard to our voluntary acts, and hold irrespective of institutional arrangements. Acquired duties are the reverse. We have them because of our voluntary acts or our place in institutional arrangements. The duties to keep a promise and to honor a contract are acquired duties. The duty to treat others justly is an unacquired duty. The analysis of rights in terms of valid claims applies to duties of both kinds. In the case of promising, for example, the person to whom the promise is made, the promisee, can have a valid claim to fulfillment of the promise and a valid claim against the promisor to do so. The promisee will have a valid claim to, in this case, if it is within the powers of the promisor to carry out his end of the bargain, and the promisee will have a valid claim against the promisor if, as is true in this case, The claim is made against an assignable individual, namely the promissor, and if the moral rule, keep your promises, is valid. Why this rule is valid will be explained in 8.12. For present purposes, the example of promising should suffice to illustrate how the analysis of rights in terms of valid claims is applicable to the analysis of acquired duties, and how, once it is applied, the existence of correlative rights can be established. Our primary interest, for reasons that will become clearer as we proceed, concerns the application of this analysis to unacquired duties. Paramount among our unacquired duties is the duty of justice, the duty not to treat individuals differently in the absence of a relevant dissimilarity. Of course, how this formal principle of justice should be normatively interpreted occasions heated disputes, as we saw in the preceding chapter. Questions about how this principle should be interpreted to one side, it should be clear that the duty to be just differs in kind from, say, the duty to keep a promise. I come to have this latter duty as a result of my voluntary acts. Not so in the case of the duty of justice. That is a duty we have, in Rawls's words, without regard to our voluntary acts, and irrespective of institutional arrangements. Some would dispute this. Given his version of rational egoism, for example, Jan Narveson evidently would deny that we have an unacquired or natural duty of justice. If morality consists of the arrangements struck by rational egoists, it is difficult to see how the duty of justice could be otherwise. We would acquire that duty, given this position, if or as we reached the agreement to treat one another justly, however such treatment is interpreted, in which case our duty of justice would arise as a result of our voluntary acts. Reasons have been advanced against this vision of morality in the earlier discussion of Narveson's views. They will not be repeated here. The inadequacy of a Narvesonian account of morality in general, especially its arbitrary exclusion of moral patients as individuals who are owed direct duties, casts sufficient doubt on its adequacy in the particular case of our direct duty of justice. Rawls's contractarianism is less clear on this issue. Rawls does assert that the duty of justice is a natural duty, but what he then goes on to say about the principles of justice makes it less clear whether the duty of justice does not, after all, depend on the voluntary acts of some persons, namely the hypothetical acts of those in the original position. Here is what he says. From the standpoint of justice as fairness, a fundamental natural duty is the duty of justice. This duty requires us to support and comply with just institutions that exist and apply to us. It also constrains us to further just arrangements not yet established, at least when this can be done without too much cost to ourselves. Thus, if the basic structure of society is just, or as just as it is reasonable to expect in such circumstances, everyone has his duty to do his part in the existing scheme. Each is bound to these institutions, independent of his voluntary acts, performative or otherwise. Thus, even though the principles of duty are derived from a contractarian point of view, they do not presuppose an act of consent, express or tacit, or indeed any voluntary act in order to apply. The principles that hold for individuals, just as the principles for institutions, are those that would be acknowledged in the original position. These principles are understood as the outcome of a hypothetical agreement. This passage poses difficult problems of interpretation. It begins with a claim about the kind of duty the duty of justice is, namely, it is a natural duty, and as such, does not depend on any of our voluntary acts. About halfway through the quoted passage, however, we are told that the principles of duty are similarly independent of any voluntary act on our part, and then at the passage's conclusion, Rawls states that these principles are understood as the outcome of a hypothetical agreement. What is unclear is whether what Rawls says about the principles of justice also applies to what he says about the duty of justice. If it does, some unhappy consequences result. For consider, we have the natural duty of justice, unlike the duty to keep a promise, independently of any of our voluntary acts. The principles of justice, however, are to be understood as the outcome of a hypothetical agreement. Now, if what is said about these principles also applies to the duty of justice, what we have is the view that our having the duty of justice, although it is not contingent on any of our voluntary acts, is contingent upon the acts of those who reach the hypothetical agreements in the original position. This is eminently unsatisfactory. Just as our having the duty of justice cannot depend on our voluntary acts, so our having this duty cannot depend on the hypothetical acts of others. Presumably, therefore, Rawls's view is not that our having this duty is contingent on what those in the original position decide. Rather, it is that the principles of justice, that is, what duties justice requires one to do or forbear, are what are decided upon by those in the original position. Interpreted in this way, Rawls's position does not have the air of paradox it would have if he were interpreted to hold both that our having duties of justice does not depend on our voluntary acts, and that our having these duties does depend on the hypothetical acts of others. However, even when interpreted in this way, Rawls's position, at least as he understands it, fails to provide an adequate account of those to whom we have these duties. Like Narvison's account, Rawls's is demonstrably arbitrary when it excludes moral patience from the class of individuals to whom duties of justice are owed. Now, at least some acquired duties, for example the duty to keep a promise, arguably have correlative rights. For example, the right of the promisee against the promissor. Whether this is true in the case of all acquired duties can remain an open question, given the purposes of the present study. This question is pursued further in 8.9 in the discussion of special considerations. One question that is not open is whether all duties are acquired duties. That is, duties that arise as a result of our voluntary acts or because of our place in an institutional arrangement. Some duties do not belong in this category, and among those duties that do not, the most important for present purposes, are those that involve the just treatment of all those who are morally relevantly similar. Of course, what treatment is due those who are morally relevantly similar depends on how the formal principle of justice is interpreted, an issue I shall explore momentarily. The central point worth noting here is that since the duty of justice is not an acquired duty, the right to just treatment, if there is such a right, that is, if the claim to just treatment is a valid claim, must be viewed as an unacquired right, what I shall term a basic right. Like its correlative duty, this right cannot reasonably be viewed as one we have as a result of our voluntary acts or because of our place in an institutional arrangement. No attempt to validate this right can be adequate if it miscategorizes this right, that is, if it treats this basic right as an acquired right. The validation of this right offered in the next section cannot be disputed on this ground. 8.4. The Respect Principle and the Right to Respectful Treatment. In the previous chapter, a normative interpretation of the formal principle of justice was given and defended. That interpretation rests on the postulate of inherent value, the view that all those individuals who satisfy the subject of a life criterion are intelligibly and non-arbitrarily viewed as having a kind of value, inherent value, that is distinct from, is not reducible to, and is incommensurate with the intrinsic value of their own or anyone else's experiences, for example, their pleasures or preference satisfactions, and that all who have this kind of value have it equally. These individuals, it was argued, are therefore due, as a matter of strict justice, treatment that is respectful of the kind of value they have, and all are owed this treatment equally. In particular, individuals who have inherent value are not to be treated as if they were mere receptacles of valuable experiences, for example, pleasures, a view that opens the door to allowing that some moral agents or patients may be harmed, for example, made to suffer, because the aggregate balance of pleasure over pain for all those affected by the outcome would yield the best aggregate consequences. The validity of the respect principle, interpreted as a predistributive normative principle of justice, was supported by showing that the arguments for it meet the requirements of making an ideal moral judgment, to the extent that this is reasonable to require, and by showing that this principle itself meets the appropriate criteria for evaluating moral principles: adequacy of scope and precision, consistency, and conformity with our reflective intuitions. The case has been made, in short, to the extent to which the case can be made, for rational acceptance of the respect principle as a valid normative principle of just treatment. It now remains to be asked whether, given the preceding analysis of rights as valid claims and the requirements of validating claims, the case can be made for recognizing the basic right of those who have inherent value to the respectful treatment the respect principle requires of us. The argument for the recognition of this right may be set forth as follows. First, justice, unlike charity, for example, is something one can intelligibly claim as one's due, something that one is owed. Though a representative of the United Way has no valid basis on which to claim that I owe it to his organization in particular to make a financial contribution, he does have a moral basis on which to claim that I owe it to him to treat him as justice requires. This is true regardless of how justice is interpreted. It is not peculiar to the interpretation favored here. Even a perfectionist theory allows that justice is owed to anyone who can be treated justly or unjustly. It just so happens that on perfectionist theories, what is due varies considerably, depending upon how much or how little different individuals happen to possess certain virtues, for example, artistic talents. There is, therefore, nothing conceptually odd in maintaining that individuals who have inherent value can claim just treatment as their due, or have this claimed on their behalf because they have a right to such treatment. Since what is being claimed as their right is something claimed as their due, since justice is due them, and since the duty of justice is an unacquired duty, there is nothing logically untoward in correlating a basic right to just treatment with the unacquired duty of justice. Second, if one's making a claim to just treatment is to be valid, then both the claim to and claim against aspects of such a claim must be valid. Demands for just treatment, when these are informed by the notion of respect central to the respect principle, can be validated on both counts. Such claims are valid claims too. I can specify what it is that I am claiming as my due, namely treatment that accords with the respect principle, and the treatment I claim as my due is within the powers or capacities of those against whom I make the claim. Moreover, the claim I make is a valid claim against. First, because I can identify those individuals against whom I make it, namely all those moral agents who do or might have any moral dealings with me. And second, because the claim I make against them is, in Feinberg's words, called for by a valid moral principle, the respect principle. My claim to respectful treatment, therefore, is a valid claim all considered, and thus, given the analysis of moral rights as valid claims, I have the moral right to be treated with respect. Third, the moral right to respectful treatment is not mine alone. All individuals like me in the relevant respects must also have this right, have it equally, and have it independently of its recognition by the laws of this or that nation. This is part of what it means to speak of moral rights, and no account of moral rights or their validation can be adequate if it fails to meet these requirements. The analysis of rights as valid claims and the procedure outlined for validating them pass these tests when it comes to possession of this right by moral agents. Since all moral agents are like me in the relevant respects, all have inherent value, and all have it equally, all have the same right to respectful treatment that I do, and all have this right equally. Moreover, since the basis for this right is independent of the legislative acts of any individuals, our having this right is independent of its recognition by the laws of this or that nation. Indeed, precisely because the basis for this right is independent of the laws of any nation, appeals to this right can be used in the way Lyons recognizes, as a way to argue for changes in the social order, including changes in the law itself. To avoid the conclusions reached in the present section, one would have to show either that the respect principle is not a valid moral principle, or that the analysis of rights as valid claims is unsatisfactory, or that the argument just given in support of recognizing the validity of, and thus the right to, respectful treatment in the case of all moral agents is deficient. The defense of the respect principle was given in the previous chapter and will not be repeated here. The argument just given in support of the right to respectful treatment will have to stand on its own as given. Nothing further will be offered in direct support. As for the correctness of the analysis of rights in terms of valid claims, some objections to it will be considered, but only after the full implications of recognizing the right to respectful treatment have been set forth. Here, it will suffice to remind those utilitarian critics of the rhetoric of rights that, in analyzing rights as valid claims, we have not seized upon an analysis that finds no home in the literature of utilitarianism. It is, after all, the very analysis Mill favors. 8.5. The Rights of Moral Patients. The case for recognizing the moral right of moral patients to respectful treatment parallels the argument given in the preceding section. The validity of the claim to respectful treatment, and thus the case for recognition of the right to such treatment, cannot be any stronger or weaker in the case of moral patients than it is in the case of moral agents. Both have inherent value, and both have it equally. Thus, both are owed respectful treatment as a matter of justice. Moreover, since the validity of the claim to such treatment in the case of moral agents has been shown, the same is true in the case of the validity of the claim to such treatment in the case of moral patients. It lies within the power of all moral agents to treat all those moral patients with whom they do or might have any dealings with the respect that, as possessors of inherent value, they are due. Similarly, in the case of moral patients having valid claims against moral agents, the individuals against whom the claim holds are all those moral agents who do or might interact with moral patients, and the claims made against moral agents in this regard are validated by appeal to the respect principle and the postulate of inherent value on which it rests. Because moral patients have inherent value and have neither more nor less inherent value than that possessed by moral agents, they have the same right to respectful treatment possessed by moral agents, and they possess this right equally. That is, moral agents and moral patients have an equal right to respectful treatment. Moreover, because moral agents have this right independently of the legislative acts, the laws, of this or that nation, the same is true in the case of moral patients. In the case of animals in particular, therefore, one cannot argue against their having the basic moral rights in question on the grounds that it is not recognized as a legal right by any nation. It would be arbitrary in the extreme, therefore, to accept the postulate of inherent value, the respect principle, the analysis of rights as valid claims, and the argument for the right to respectful treatment in the case of moral agents, and then to deny that moral patients have this right. If the arguments used to validate this right in the case of moral agents are sound, then moral patients, including animals, have this right also. That is the destination toward which this work has been moving from the outset. It is not an act of kindness to treat animals respectfully. It is an act of justice. It is not the sentimental interests of moral agents that grounds our duties of justice to children, the impaired, the senile, or other moral patients, including animals. It is respect for their inherent value. The myth of the privileged moral status of moral agents has no clothes. It is of more than passing interest to note that the argument for recognition of the basic moral rights of moral agents and patients does not depend on appeals to the utility of recognizing these rights. As was observed in the original characterization of the rights view, certain individuals are viewed as having certain rights according to this view, independently of considerations about the value of the consequences that result from recognizing that they have them. For the rights position, basic moral rights are more basic than utility and independent of it, so that the principal reason why, say, killing a moral agent or patient is wrong, if and when it is, lies in the violation of the individual's moral rights, and not in considerations about all those others who will or who will not receive pleasure or pain, or who will not have their preferences satisfied or frustrated. The argument of the present section should make it clear how those who favor the rights view can argue for their position independently of appeals to utility. Certain individuals have the basic right to respectful treatment because of the kind of value they have, inherent value, a kind of value that is itself independent of utility, and the criterion that makes its attribution to certain individuals both intelligible and non-arbitrary, the subject of a life criterion, also makes no reference to, and thus is independent of appeals to, the utility of recognizing it. It is not, then, for utilitarian reasons that we recognize and validate the basic rights of moral agents and patients, not by appeal to the general welfare. Their basic rights are validated by appeals to the respect that, as individuals who possess inherent value, they are due as a matter of strict justice. 8.6. A miscellany of objections. A number of objections can be anticipated and deserve an airing. Some challenge the analysis of rights as valid claims. Others dispute the necessity of recognizing rights, however they are analyzed. The objections, in short, do not all belong to the same family of ideas. But let us consider each in its turn, with the hope that, by meeting the challenge each poses, the position they challenge will itself be clearer and its reasonableness more evident. There are alternatives to analyzing rights in terms of valid claims. H.J. McCloskey, an Australian moral philosopher, subscribes to the entitlement theory of rights and is critical of viewing rights as valid claims. We will have to be content with considering McCloskey's main criticism, where, by denying that all rights are claims against, he disputes the view that all moral rights are valid claims. Special rights are sometimes against specific individuals or institutions. For example, rights created by promises, contracts, etc. But these differ from characteristic general rights, where the right is simply a right to. Footnote. The analysis of rights as entitlements is defective. Whether you are entitled to do something must depend on whether it is permissible for you to do it, that is, whether you would be doing wrong in doing it, and whether you are entitled to do it, that is, whether you are within your rights to do it, must depend on whether, in doing it, you would be violating any right others have against you. The analysis of what you are entitled to thus uses the notion of rights rather than analyzing that notion. End footnote. What McCloskey calls special rights are those rights that arise as a result of our voluntary acts. They are acquired rights correlated with acquired duties. If I make a promise to you, I acquire the duty to keep the promise, and you acquire the right to hold me to it. In the case of unacquired duties, for example, the duty of justice, there are also correlative unacquired basic rights. I have the duty to treat you justly, but not because of my voluntary acts, and you have a right to be treated justly. What McCloskey thus seems to be denying is that unlike acquired or special rights, unacquired, basic rights are not rights we have against anyone. This objection fails. It is true that in the case of acquired duties and rights, the right is characteristically a right against someone in particular. For example, your right against me to keep my promise. But there is no reason why all rights must be rights against an individual or against a few individuals, if they are to be rights against others. The right I have to respectful treatment is a right I have to be treated respectfully, a right I have against not just this or that individual, but against all moral agents with whom I do or might have moral dealings. The sheer number of those against whom I have this right is no reason to deny that I have it against anyone. There is, it is true, a paradoxical-sounding implication of this view, namely that I have this right against literally hundreds of millions of people, and some might find this odd at least. Feinberg, however, has a reply that removes the air of oddness and the sound of paradox, but it also has problems of its own. There is, he writes, nothing troublesome in the idea that I have rights against and duties to legions of moral agents. If a general moral rule gives me a right of non-interference, for example, in a certain respect against everybody, then there are literally hundreds of millions of people who have a duty toward me in that respect. And if the same general rule gives the same right to everyone else, then it imposes on me hundreds of millions of duties, or duties towards hundreds of millions of people. I see nothing paradoxical about this, however. The duties, after all, are negative, and I can discharge all of them at a stroke simply by minding my own business. And if all human beings make up one moral community, and there are hundreds of millions of human beings, we should expect there to be hundreds of millions of moral relations holding between them. In his reply, Feinberg assumes that there are purely negative duties and negative rights. My right to non-interference is a negative right correlated with your negative duty not to interfere in my affairs. If you do not interfere, you have, Feinberg implies, fulfilled your duty to me in this regard. Indeed, since the duty is negative, you can fulfill it to literally millions of people at a stroke simply by minding your own business. In saying this, Feinberg overlooks the other side of rights, even so-called negative rights, something to which Mill was wisely sensitive, namely, the duty of assistance. If you have a right to non-interference, then my duty to you in this regard does not consist merely in my minding my own business. I also have a prima facie duty to assist you if others deny you the exercise of this right. The duty of assistance is a prima facie duty, certainly. There may be other, more pressing moral demands that override this duty in particular cases. But to suppose that I automatically do all that I am duty-bound to do with respect to your right, merely by minding my own business, is to mistake half the picture for the whole. Having said this, Feinberg's reply to McCloskey still stands. The sheer number of those to whom I have duties, or who have rights against me, cannot militate against the adequacy of analyzing rights in terms of valid claims. Those who have a right to non-interference have a valid claim against literally millions, and literally millions have a duty of non-interference in this case. But these latter also have a prima facie duty of assistance. Feinberg limits his remarks to human beings, but there is no reason why what he says should be less true if we add our duties to animals or their rights against us. The principal negative duty we have in their case is not to treat them disrespectfully, and the correlative negative right they have against us is not to be treated in ways that ignore their equal inherent value. But just as our negative duty not to interfere in the lives of others does not consist merely in our minding our own business, so our duty regarding the respectful treatment of animals involves more than our taking care to treat them with respect. Since they have a valid claim to respectful treatment, we have a prima facie duty to assist them when others treat them in ways that violate their rights. We shall have occasion to remind ourselves of this other side of rights in what follows. It is possible to accept the analysis of moral rights as valid claims, and deny that animals, and by implication, moral patients generally have moral rights. An objection of Ross's takes this form. On the whole, since we mean by a right something that can be justly claimed, we should probably say that animals have no rights, not because the claim to humane treatment would not be just if it were made, but because they cannot make it. Now, to deny that animals have rights, or to hold that we should probably say that they lack them because they cannot justly claim anything, is to disqualify more than animals. All moral patients are similarly deficient in this respect, and thus all must be disqualified. Once this is recognized, Ross's objection can be seen to involve a number of confusions. There are some rights that it is not unreasonable to deny that moral patients have. For example, the acquired right that persons have to their doctoral degree once they have satisfactorily completed the requirements for obtaining it is such a right. Moral patients do not have this right, but not because they cannot claim it. They do not have it because they have not fulfilled the appropriate requirements to acquire this right. Lacking as they are in this respect, they do not have the right that successful candidates acquire, to use Rawls' words, as a result of their voluntary acts, or because of their place in an institutional arrangement. In the case of unacquired, that is, basic rights in general, and of the basic right to respectful treatment in particular, however, no similar basis for excluding moral patients is at hand. Individuals can have valid claims and not make claims, or even lack the ability to make them. To make a claim, we have said, is a performance, and no account of moral rights can be adequate that makes the existence of basic moral rights contingent upon the performance of this or that voluntary act. To have a valid claim, as distinct from making a claim, is to have a certain sort of moral status. And one can have this status without claiming it, or even being able to do so. Whether one has this status depends not on whether one can claim one's rights, but on whether one has them. And this depends on whether sound arguments can be given for the recognition of these rights independently of the ability on the part of the individual who possesses them to claim them. American jurisprudence, for example, recognizes this possibility in the case of the legal rights of children and the impaired. Though they lack the ability to claim their legal rights, or even to understand that they have them, the law recognizes that others, for example, legal guardians, acting in their behalf, can claim the rights of these moral patients. There is no reason why the case of the basic moral rights of moral patients must or should be judged any differently. Just as these individuals can have legal rights that they neither understand nor can claim on their own, so these same individuals can have basic moral rights that they fail to understand, but they can be claimed for them by others acting in their behalf. In the particular case of animals, therefore, they have the right to respectful treatment despite their inability to understand this, and notwithstanding their powerlessness to make or press their claims in this or any regard. That burden falls to those who would act for them. In saying this, we say nothing that departs from Mills's important insight, when he notes that to have a right is to have something society ought to defend me in the possession of. When, as in the case of moral patients, they have rights but are themselves incapable of claiming or defending them, then the duty society has to do this for these individuals is, one might say, all the greater. The less cognizant individuals are of their rights, the less power they have to defend them, the more we who understand and recognize their rights must do for them in defense of their rights. With this observation, we again remind ourselves that respect for the basic rights of others involves prima facie duties of assistance. Because those who have the right to respectful treatment have a right to this treatment, my duty to them is not restricted just to my avoiding treating them unjustly. I am also duty-bound to defend them in the possession of this right, and what possession of this right entitles them to. Thus, if, for example, animals are used in scientific research in ways that violate their right to respectful treatment, and assuming that I myself am not engaged in such research, it does not follow that I have thereby done all that morality requires of me. There is also my prima facie duty to assist those who are the victims of injustice, and the powerlessness of animals to ensure that their rights are respected arguably makes my duty to assist them, if anything, greater, not lesser. It is sometimes claimed, more in discussions than in print, that recognition of the rights of animals leads to absurd consequences. If sheep have rights, it is claimed, then these are violated by wolves and other predatory animals who harm their prey in a variety of ways, for example, by causing them acute suffering. But if we have a duty of assistance to animals to stop those who violate their rights, then are we not duty-bound to stop the wolf in his tracks, so to speak, and protect the sheep? However, were we to do this, the wolf could hardly be the beneficiary, since he would be denied necessary sustenance. Were we to carry out our duty to assist the sheep against the wolf's violations of the sheep's rights, we could only succeed in violating the wolf's rights. Whereas if we allow the wolf to violate the sheep's rights, we fail to do what we should do to assist the sheep. Whatever we do, therefore, we stand to be morally condemned, which is absurd. And since it is the attribution of rights to animals that leads to these absurd consequences, we have rational, principled grounds to refrain from attributing rights to them. This argument is open to the very charge of absurdity it levels against attributing rights to animals. In the earlier discussion of moral agency and patiency, the point was made and defended that moral patients have no duties and thus do not have the particular duty to respect the rights of others. Only moral agents can have duties, and this because only these individuals have the cognitive and other abilities necessary for being held morally accountable for what they do or fail to do. Wolves are not moral agents. They cannot bring impartial reasons to bear on their decision-making, cannot, that is, apply the formal principle of justice or any of its normative interpretations. That being so, wolves in particular, and moral patients generally, cannot themselves meaningfully be said to have duties to anyone, nor therefore the particular duty to respect the rights possessed by other animals. In claiming that we have a prima facie duty to assist those animals whose rights are violated, therefore, we are not claiming that we have a duty to assist the sheep against the attack of the wolf, since the wolf neither can nor does violate anyone's rights. The absurd results leveled against the attribution of rights to animals simply do not materialize. Another common attempt to refute the rights view is to argue that it fails radically to match some of our considered beliefs. Imagine 5 survivors are on a lifeboat. Because of limits of size, the boat can only support 4. All weigh approximately the same and would take up approximately the same amount of space. 4 of the 5 are normal adult human beings. The 5th is a dog. One must be thrown overboard or else all will perish. Whom should it be? If all have an equal right to be treated respectfully, must we draw straws? Would it not be unjust, given the rights view, to choose to sacrifice the dog in preference to one of the humans? And doesn't this show that the rights view, because it authorizes appeals to considered beliefs as a legitimate way to test moral principles, dies at its own hands, so to speak? For no reasonable person would suppose that the dog has a right to life that is equal to the humans, or that the animal should be given an equal chance in the lottery for survival. This objection can be adequately addressed only after the grounds for overriding the right not to be harmed have been explored, and must await its proper time. One final objection attempts to resurrect utilitarianism as a theory that can account for all moral rights, without our having to postulate inherent value, and without validating rights by reference to the respect principle. This is Mill's position, and there is much to be said for it. Society does have the duty to protect individual rights, and at least part of this challenge can be affected by the force of law or by that of education or opinion. But it does not follow from this that the only reason one can give to support this effort is the one Mill gives, namely, general utility. Indeed, this cannot be the sole reason, cannot even be an adequate reason in the case of the basic rights possessed by moral patients. As was argued in the earlier discussion of rule utilitarianism, that position fails to provide a satisfactory justification of unacquired direct duties owed to moral patients, whether these be humans or animals. That theory, therefore, cannot adequately ground rules by reference to which the rights of moral patients can be validated. At the very most, and it is highly questionable that rule utilitarianism is equal to this task, that theory could ground rights possessed by moral agents, rights that are validated in their case by appeal to valid moral rules. However, since no theory can be adequate, all considered, if it fails to account for the unacquired direct duties owed to and the correlative rights of moral patients, rule utilitarianism cannot be the adequate theory we seek. As for act utilitarianism, moral rights, conceived as valid claims, can find no place in the thought of those who view appeals to rights as rhetoric. 8.7. Overriding the right not to be harmed. Individuals who have inherent value have an equal basic right to be treated with respect. According to the rights view, this is a right that we can never be justified in ignoring or overriding. In all our moral dealings with moral agents and patients, we must always treat them with that respect to which, as possessors of inherent value, they are due. This is the fundamental precept of the rights view. From it, it follows that we must never harm individuals who have inherent value on the grounds that all those affected by the outcome will thereby secure the best aggregate balance of intrinsic values, for example, pleasures, over intrinsic disvalues, for example, pains. To harm some for these reasons is to treat them as if they were mere receptacles of value, lacking any value in their own right, which is therefore to treat them in ways that fail to display the respect they are due as a matter of strict justice. Other ways of failing to show respect are discussed in 8.11 through 8.12 and 9.1. Because individuals who have inherent value have a valid claim, and thus in this case a basic right to respectful treatment, because their having this kind of value can be used to derive the unacquired prima facie direct duty not to harm them, because basic rights are validated by appeals to valid moral principles of unacquired duty, and because the claim made against being harmed is a valid claim to and a valid claim against, it follows that individuals who have inherent value also have a valid claim, and thus, in this case, a basic prima facie right not to be harmed, the validation of this right resting ultimately on the respect principle and the postulate of inherent value on which it rests. To say this right is a prima facie right is to say that 1. Consideration of this right is always a morally relevant consideration, and 2. Anyone who would harm another or allow others to do so must be able to justify doing so by A. appealing to other valid moral principles, and by B. showing that these principles morally outweigh the right not to be harmed in a given case. It is possible to deny that this right is prima facie only. Some assert or imply that some individuals have an absolute right not to be harmed, a right, that is, that may never justifiably be overridden. One principle that implies this is the pacifist principle. We ought never to use harmful violence, no matter what the circumstances. A second principle, the innocence principle, is more restrictive. It allows that causing harm to some may be justified, but it is never justified when those who are harmed are innocent. We ought never, this principle declares, do anything that harms the innocent, no matter what the circumstances. Neither principle is valid. To show this, we will first consider 4 different situations where what causes harm can be justified by appeal to our considered beliefs. These are 1. Self-defense by the innocent, 2. Punishment of the guilty, 3. Innocent shields, and 4. Innocent threats. A 5th type of case, prevention cases, will be explored later. This initial survey will be limited to situations involving only human beings. Self-defense by the innocent. The most obvious case where the right not to be harmed may be justifiably overridden if appeals to our considered beliefs are allowed, involves self-defense by the innocent. To illustrate this, suppose you are attacked by a violent assailant. Can you be justified in using violence to defend yourself, even though, in doing so, you are certain to harm your attacker? Those who accept the pacifist principle say you cannot, since the use of harmful violence is always wrong, no matter what the circumstances. Its use in self-defense, even when the defender is innocent, is not morally permitted. Jan Narveson argues that the pacifist's position is incoherent. If the use of harmful violence is wrong, he argues, it must be wrong not to use it if it is the only way to prevent greater violence in the future. But if it is wrong not to use it in such circumstances, then its use must be justified in such circumstances. And if it is justified in such circumstances, then its use cannot be wrong, no matter what the circumstances. The pacifist's position is thereby exposed as inadequate because inconsistent. Narveson's critique of pacifism assumes that all pacifists are consequentialists, persons who prohibit the use of violence now because of the consequences its use will bring about in the future. Against such a position, Narveson's critique is successful, if those who advance it are willing to concede that the use of harmful violence sometimes does reduce the amount of violence in the future, and that we can know that this is true in a given case. It is not clear that Narveson's adversaries would concede this. They might claim that the use of harmful violence always leads to more violence in the future, or that we can never know that it will not. These are bold empirical claims, to say the least, and like any other such claim, stand in need of careful, thorough, well-documented support. No pacifist of the consequentialist variety has to date succeeded in meeting this challenge, and it is unclear that any could. For example, to cite this or that case where the use of harmful violence led to more violence in the future, either large-scale uses of violence, for example wars, or less grand uses, for example fistfights between children, simply will not do. First, because even if one could point to some cases in which we knew that the use of violence led to more violence, it would not follow that this is true in all cases. And second, because just establishing that the use of violence now will lead to the use of more violence in the future is not to establish enough for this brand of pacifism. The possibility remains that not using violence now will also lead to the use of violence in the future, and that the amount of future violence brought about by nonviolent behavior now would exceed, perhaps greatly exceed, the amount of harmful violence brought about by the use of violence now. All of which is to say that pacifists, in all fairness to them and their position, more than have their work cut out for them if they regard the pacifist principle as a consequentialist principle, and if they are to avoid Narveson's charge of incoherence. Since it cannot be reasonable to regard a principle as valid if it stands in need of extensive empirical backing and lacks it, and since the pacifist principle, interpreted as a consequentialist principle, stands in need of and lacks such backing, we are justified in denying the claims made on its behalf by this brand of pacifist. The pacifist has an option. He could maintain that the use of harmful violence is wrong in itself, and irredeemably so, apart from its future consequences. The pacifist, that is, could subscribe to a non-consequentialist version of pacifism. Now, to dispute this version of pacifism by arguing, as Narveson does, that the use of harmful violence in some cases might actually reduce the amount of violence in the future would be judged strictly irrelevant by those who are non-consequentialist pacifists, since they do not rest their opposition to violence on its consequences. Objections that rely on appeals to consequences will simply slip by their position rather than engaging it head-on. Recognizable forms of pacifism thus seem immune to Narveson's attempt to demonstrate the incoherence of all forms of pacifism. If we are to have reasons for rejecting the non-consequentialist version of pacifism, therefore, we must look elsewhere than to the test of consistency. Among the grounds for rejecting the pacifist principle, the most telling involve appeals to our reflective intuitions. Included in our considered beliefs are those that concern the right of the innocent to defend themselves against their aggressors, even if this defense involves violence, and even if its use will result in harm being done to the assailant. Granted, we do not believe that one is morally entitled to use just any violent means in any amount to repel an attack. As in the law, so in morality, a principle of proportionality commends itself. We are entitled to use force, but not excessive force, to defend ourselves, while allowing for the difficulty in conditions of stress and emergency of determining what force is excessive. For example, use of a lethal gas is prima facie disproportionately harmful as a defense against a thief who snatches a purse. Use of a temporarily disabling device, for example, mace, is not. While we may concede that some pacifists hold a consistent position, very little else can be said in its favor. Because this position is so at odds with our considered beliefs in a broad range of cases, and because the reasonableness of appealing to our reflective intuitions to test moral principles has been defended earlier, we have principled reasons to reject the pacifist principle in its non-consequentialist form. Of course, if the pacifist could show that, independently of appeals to our considered beliefs, he has a sound theory, then it is our intuitions, not his theory, that would have to be changed. In all fairness to pacifism, however, it must be said that no pacifist has shown this, that the onus of doing so must be borne by those who believe in this position, and that the mere sincerity of intensity with which the belief is held go no way toward meeting this challenge. After all, many Nazis evidently sincerely believed in their position with great intensity. Punishment of the guilty. A second, and in some respects related kind of case, involves punishment of the guilty. Punishment is not punishment unless it involves some loss or diminution of the quality of the life of, that is, some harm done to, the person being punished, as when, for example, individuals lose some portion of their wealth by being fined or lose their liberty in varying degrees by being imprisoned. A principle of proportionality applies here too. The punishment, we say, must fit the crime. The harm done to the offender must be proportionate to the harm done to the victim if justice is to be done. This leaves open the question of whether punishment has any further purpose, for example, to reform the offender or to deter others from committing comparable offenses. Whatever further purposes punishment may have, there is no punishment, and thus nothing to have a further purpose if the offender is not harmed, most notably in the form of deprivations. Though the justice of how we punish and the fairness of the means by which we select who to punish are matters of increasing moral consternation, the belief that mentally competent adult criminals merit punishment is a conviction most are likely to count as one among their considered beliefs. How reasonable we are in believing this, if we do, fortunately, is a matter we will be able to avoid exploring in the present work, since even if we are justified in punishing, and thus harming, those who are guilty, overriding the right of animals not to be harmed cannot be defended on these grounds, since animals, because they are not moral agents, cannot be guilty. Though this is not the occasion to work out the full implications, it is worth noting in passing that the rights view could not sanction any form of punishment that failed to treat the convicted criminal with that respect to which he or she is due, as one who possesses inherent value. For no one can gain or lose this value by anything that person does or fails to do. In particular, therefore, we cannot justify punishing the criminal on the grounds that this will bring about a better aggregate balance of goods over evils for all those affected by the outcome. That would be to treat the criminal as a mere receptacle, and that is contrary to what justice requires, according to the rights view. Regarded in this light, the rights view is sympathetic to the recognition of the rights of the criminal, although it is also sympathetic to the view that some people deserve to be punished, that is, harmed, because of the harm they have done. Innocent shields. Tragically, situations arise in the world where innocent individuals are used as shields to protect those engaged in unlawful activities. A bank robber takes a teller for his protection, for example, or terrorists take hostages. In both cases, the innocent are used in the interests of those who operate outside the law, in the belief that, so long as those who are innocent are held captive, those who would attack their captors will think twice before doing so. Granted that the hostages are innocent, and granted that to do anything that will foreseeably cause harm to the innocent is certainly prima facie wrong, are there adequate reasons for believing that this is always wrong, no matter what the circumstances? If pacifism in any of its forms, consequentialist or non-consequentialist, was a reasonable position, then we would know how to answer this question straight away. We ought never to use violent means that will foreseeably result in harm being done to the captives, or to their captors. But pacifism is not a reasonable position. An alternative to pacifism allows harm in some cases, but disallows it in all cases where those who are harmed are innocent. Those who hold this position subscribe to the innocence principle. It is always wrong to harm the innocent, no matter what the circumstances. The right of the innocent not to be harmed, in other words, is absolute, a right never to be overridden. The innocence principle faces the same kind of objections as the pacifist principle. Those who advocate this principle may do so either as consequentialists or as non-consequentialists. If the former, they are likely to argue that the right of the innocent not to be harmed ought never to be overridden, because to do so will always lead to harm being done to a greater number of innocents in the future. As in the case of the pacifist principle, the innocence principle, when interpreted consequentially, can only be as compelling as the empirical claim on which it rests, and it is radically unclear that overriding the right of the innocent will always lead to more innocents being harmed. Imagine this case. A terrorist has taken possession of a tank and has commenced to kill one by one the 26 innocent hostages he has bound to a wall. All attempts to negotiate release of the hostages are flatly rejected, and there is every reason to believe that the terrorist will kill all the hostages if nothing is done. Under the circumstances, the only reasonable way to save these hostages is to blow up the tank. Suppose the means to blow it up are at hand. Only suppose the terrorist has taken the precaution of strapping another innocent hostage to the tank. Any means used to blow up the tank will kill that hostage. What ought we to do? On the consequentialist interpretation of the innocence principle, we ought not to blow up the tank because A, this will harm the one innocent hostage, and because B, overriding the right of the innocent not to be harmed will always lead to harm being done to more innocents in the future. This latter claim lacks credibility in the present case. At least in the foreseeable short run, overriding the right of the one hostage, the innocent shield, will prevent harm being done to the remaining hostages. There is, that is, a strong epistemic presumption in the terrorist case against the empirical claim made on behalf of the consequentialist interpretation of the innocence principle. Granted, one who subscribes to this version of the innocence principle could maintain that whatever might be true in the short run, more innocents will be harmed in the long run if we override the right of the innocent shield in this case. But the burden of proof must surely fall to those who claim this. It is not enough that they express this belief as an article of faith, however sincerely or passionately held it might be. One wants detailed empirical backing for so sweeping a claim, And unless one has it, there is more than ample reason to contest the validity of the innocence principle in its consequentialist interpretation, on the grounds that those who advance it fall far short of the ideal of having the relevant information. If, in the face of these difficulties, harming the innocent is claimed to be irredeemably wrong apart from the consequences, then, as was true in the case of the analogous interpretation of the pacifist principle, this interpretation of the innocence principle can be dismissed on the grounds that it is radically at odds with our considered beliefs in a broad range of cases. Since the innocent have a right not to be harmed, since their having this right grounds a duty on our part to defend them in the possession of their right, since the 26 hostages are innocent, since they cannot defend themselves, since they will be harmed if we do nothing, and since all our options are such that whatever we choose, some of the innocents directly involved will be harmed, what we ought to do is act so as to prevent the deaths of the 26. Not to do so would be to fail to do what we must if we are to ensure that their right not to be harmed is not overridden when steps could be taken to prevent this. That the lone hostage is an innocent shield adds to the tragic circumstances of the case. It does not make doing what will harm him irredeemably wrong. Innocent threats. A final type of case involves innocent threats. This sort of case can be illustrated by considering an example where a young child poses a serious threat to others. Imagine the child has come into possession of a loaded revolver and has begun to fire it at us. Since the child is not a moral agent, we cannot view his moral status in the same way as ordinary adults. The child, that is not guilty, hence the aptness of referring to the child as an innocent threat. Is it ever permissible in such cases to use means to prevent the child from seriously endangering our lives, even if the means used will or are likely to harm the child? It is difficult to imagine how a negative answer could be defended, short of making an appeal to either pacifism or the innocence principle, positions we have already rejected. Since we are innocent of any relevant wrongdoing, how can it be wrong to do what we must to defend ourselves? Granted, we ought not use excessive force, since this will, or is likely to, cause excessive harm to the innocent threat. Nevertheless, since we are innocent of any relevant wrongdoing, since we are seriously threatened by the gun-wielding child, and assuming non-violent options have been conscientiously explored, we assume that attempts to reason with the child have failed. It cannot be wrong to do what will harm the child, even though the child is innocent and so does no wrong. Now, 2 of the 4 kinds of case, namely punishment of and defense against the guilty, do not cover human moral patience. Since human moral patience can do nothing that is wrong, they can do nothing that merits punishment. Unlike competent human adults who break the law, human moral patients do not deserve to be punished, and so cannot be justifiably punished on these grounds. Similarly, though we can justifiably defend against the threats posed by human moral patients, it would be a gross distortion to view our defense as a case of the defense of the innocent against the guilty. If we are justified in doing what will foreseeably harm human moral patients because of the threat of harm they pose, it must be a case of our defending ourselves against innocent threats. Moreover, since human moral patients are innocent, there is no reason why they cannot occupy the unenviable position of innocent shields. And since there are some cases where it is permissible to harm an innocent shield, there is no reason why our judgment must be different in cases where the innocent shield in question is a human moral patient. 8.8. The innocence of moral patience. An objection to the foregoing worthy of consideration does not rest on the pacifist or innocence principles. Objections based on those principles imply that the innocent, including human moral patients, are not protected enough if we allow any exceptions to these principles. The objection about to be considered implies that human moral patients are protected too much if restrictions are placed on what may be done to them because they are claimed to be innocent. Human moral patients are not innocent, this objection holds, at least not in any morally relevant sense of innocent, and so should not be covered by principles that specify how the innocent may be treated. The grounds on which this objection can be raised are as follows. It makes perfectly good sense to view moral agents as innocent, that is, as not having done anything wrong in this or that particular case. But this is because it also makes perfectly good sense to view them as capable of doing what is wrong. In saying that they are innocent, we are saying that they have done no wrong, though they might have. In the case of human moral patients, however, the same cannot be said. Since they lack the ability to do what is wrong, to say that they are innocent cannot mean that they have done no wrong, though they might have. Innocent makes sense only when guilty does, and as human moral patients are by definition incapable of being guilty, they are also incapable of being innocent. Granted, this objection continues, we may and sometimes do say that they are innocent, in the sense that they are inexperienced in the ways of the world, as when we say of a newborn baby, "She is, or looks, so innocent." Still, the sense of innocent is not the morally relevant sense, not the sense in which innocent is used when we appeal to the principle that it is prima facie wrong to harm the innocent. That sense applies only to those who can do what is wrong, not to those who, like human moral patients, cannot. To suppose that these human beings are covered by that principle is therefore to be taken in by an equivocation, harmless enough if we do not take it seriously, morally crazed if we do. This objection has a point, up to a point. Human moral agents and patients do differ with respect to their ability to do what is wrong or right. Beyond that, the objection misfires. That someone is innocent is an idea that finds a moral place in contexts outside our assessment of moral agents. Those individuals can be properly viewed as innocent who can be treated unjustly, and those individuals who can be treated unjustly are those to whom we owe duties of justice, and who have a right to just treatment against us. Accordingly, since duties of justice are directly owed both to human moral agents and patients, and since both possess the right to be treated as justice requires, it would be arbitrary in the extreme stipulatively to confine talk of who is innocent only to moral agents. Whether those who can be innocent are innocent depends on A, whether they have a given right, B, whether they receive treatment that is prima facie violative of that right, and C, whether they have done anything to merit this treatment. If they have acted in a way that merits this treatment, they are not innocent. If they have not, they are. Thus, the inability of human moral patients to do anything that merits treatment prima facie violative of their rights does not show that they cannot be innocent. On the contrary, what this shows is that, unlike human moral agents, they cannot be anything but innocent. Even in those cases in which we can justifiably override a human moral patient's right not to be harmed, as in some cases where such a human is used as an innocent shield or poses a threat, their moral status as innocent individuals remains intact. Moral principles that make requirements concerning how the innocent may be treated demonstratively include how we may treat human moral patients. The moral status of animals. A parallel argument is at hand in the case of animals. Because they are not moral agents, they can neither do what is right nor what is wrong. Like human moral patients, therefore, animals can do nothing that merits treatment that is prima facie violative of their rights. But because the case has been made for the recognition of animal rights, their inability to do what is wrong does not entail that they are not to be protected by principles that specify how the innocent are to be treated. On the contrary, as in the case of human moral patients, the inability of animals in this regard shows that they cannot be anything but innocent. The principle that it is prima facie wrong to harm the innocent demonstrably applies to our dealings with animals. Now, reasons have been advanced in the preceding. The dispute regarding prohibitions against harming the innocent is absolute, allowing of no justified exceptions, and it would be arbitrary to suppose that the status of animals somehow differs from other innocents in this regard. Since there are circumstances that justify harming human beings despite their innocence, it would be perverse to deny this possibility in the case of animals. In particular, if human moral patients may be justifiably harmed because they pose innocent threats or because they are made to serve as innocent shields, there is no reason why animals might not also be justifiably harmed in such cases. Though, as in the case of justifying harm done to human moral patients, we shall be unable to justify harming animals on the grounds of punishing or defending against the guilty. Of the two relevant kinds of cases at hand, innocent threats and innocent shields, the former is the more likely to arise. A rabid dog is guilty of no moral offense when he attacks us in our backyard, yet he poses a distinct threat. And we do no wrong if we harm the animal in the course of defending ourselves. As for animals viewed as innocent shields, some might regard this as impossible. For example, if the terrorist in our earlier example had strapped a heifer to the tank, few would view the cow's presence as constituting the slightest deterrent to blowing up the tank. But it would be a mistake to infer from this that the cow is not, or cannot be, an innocent shield. Obviously, what will work as a deterrent in such cases varies with the beliefs and attitude of those one hopes to deter. But what works does not determine the moral status of those made to serve as shields. One can imagine a case where a bank robber coerced a black man into serving as an innocent shield, and where, because of the racist beliefs and attitudes of the law enforcement officer involved, both were gunned down without the slightest hesitation. That would not show that the black hostage was not an innocent shield, only that the bank robber's selection was not prudential from his point of view. Similarly, in the case of the cow strapped to the tank, that most people wouldn't think twice before blowing up the tank shows not that the animal is not an innocent shield, but that she is not a very effective one. Of course, one can imagine circumstances in which the use of an animal as an innocent shield would be efficacious. If the animal is especially rare, for example, the last surviving male bald eagle, or especially treasured by those involved, for example, a much-loved pet, the animal might prove to be an effective shield, possibly even more effective than would a normal adult human being in some cases. But again, it would be a mistake to infer that these animals, just because they serve the purpose of the offender, are innocent shields, otherwise not. Their moral status as innocent shields is independent of their deterrent effect. Even when animals are used as innocent shields, however, it does not follow that it must be wrong to do what will harm them. That will depend on the circumstances of the case. Though because of their innocence, animals fall within the scope of the principle against harming the innocent, they cannot be protected by this principle more than other innocents. Morality does not tolerate double standards, either those that, if accepted, would work to the disadvantage of animals, nor those that, once accepted, will work to their advantage. A final objection to viewing moral patients as innocent holds that, on this view of things, anything that cannot do what is either right or wrong is innocent and must be included in the scope of principles concerning how the innocent may be treated. Thus do we have, so this objection urges, duties to mud, hair, and dirt, which is absurd. This objection misses the mark. Moral patients are intelligibly viewed as innocent because they may be treated in ways that are prima facie violative of their moral rights, and because they cannot do anything that merits treatment that violates them. The case of mud, hair, and dirt is dissimilar, since we have no reason to believe, at least the rights view itself does not aspire to offer any reason to believe, that these objects have any moral rights that may or may not be violated. 8.9. Should the numbers count? Though deficient, the innocence principle contains an important element of truth. The prima facie right not to be harmed may be justifiably overridden in the case of the guilty because of the wrong they have done, but not so in the case of the innocent. Moreover, precisely because doing what will foreseeably harm the innocent is so serious a moral matter, we should allow the right of the innocent not to be harmed to be overridden only in exceptional circumstances, and then only when we have done all that we can reasonably be expected to do before overriding it. For example, by first attempting to negotiate with the terrorist in the tank example, or by first trying to reason with the child who poses an innocent threat by firing the gun. To provide a clear helpful statement of when this right can justifiably be overridden is difficult, certainly. An attempt will be made in this regard in 8.11 and 8.12. First, though, there is an important objection to consider. A common theme of some of the examples discussed in the preceding is that one innocent individual must be harmed if harm is to be prevented for a greater number of innocents. In this sense, the discussion assumed that numbers count, not just numbers to be sure, but the numbers of those who are innocent. Is this a reasonable assumption to make? The American philosopher John M. Turek thinks not. In his provocative essay, Should the Numbers Count?, Turek lodges a series of objections against the view that we may justifiably harm one innocent in order to save the many. To make his position clearer, imagine the following case, an example of what will be referred to as prevention cases in the sequel. 51 miners are trapped in a mine cave-in and are certain to die in a very short time if nothing is done. Suppose there is only one way to reach 50 of the trapped men in the allotted time. An explosive charge, deftly placed, will open a parallel shaft through which the trapped men can then escape. But suppose there is this complication. If the explosive is used, the remaining miner, who as it happens is trapped in that shaft, is certain to be killed. This one miner could be saved, however, if we placed a similar charge in the shaft where the other miners are trapped. But doing this will have the foreseeable consequence of killing all 50 miners in that shaft. What ought we to do? If the numbers count, then it is difficult to see why we ought not to act to save the 50, even if this means foreseeably harming the one. Turek challenges this response. In circumstances like the mine example, what we should do, Turek thinks, is flip a coin to decide who to save. Heads the 50, tails the 1. I would, he writes, flip a coin in such a case, special considerations apart. I cannot see how or why the mere addition of numbers should change anything. What counts as special considerations is left somewhat vague by Turek, but at least part of what he has in mind is the possibility of there being acquired duties in such cases. Duties, that is, that moral agents have as a result of their voluntary acts, or because of their place in an institutional arrangement. We can illustrate this point in the following way. Suppose that, prior to the cave-in, the miners had instructed those in charge of rescue operations that, in the event of a cave-in, every effort should be directed at saving the maximum number of miners. This agreement, assuming it was reached voluntarily, would impose an acquired duty on the part of those in charge of rescue operations to save the 50 rather than the 1, and would count as a special consideration in Turek's view, a consideration that would tip the scales in favor of saving the 50 rather than the 1. But it would tip the scales in this direction not because the 50 are 50 times more than 1. It would do so because all had voluntarily entered into the agreement in question. When there are no special considerations that favor the one option rather than the other in prevention cases, Turek's view is that the numbers don't count. We shall return to the issue of special considerations in 8.12. But why don't the numbers count? Commenting on cases like the mine case, Turek writes that, "My way of thinking about such cases consists essentially in seriously considering what will be lost or suffered by this one person, for example, the lone miner, if I did not prevent it, that is, in this case, his death. And in considering the significance of that for him with what would be lost or suffered by anyone else if I did not prevent it. This reflects a refusal to take seriously in these situations the notion of the sum of two persons' separate losses. In other words, the loss of one miner's life cannot be added to the loss of another miner's life, and another's, and so on, to arrive at some aggregate or total of losses or harms. There is, on Turek's view, only the loss suffered by this or that individual miner. There is no aggregate of their separate losses. And it is this fact, the fact that such losses cannot be totaled, that, on Turek's view, leads to the conclusion that numbers don't count in such cases. Since there is no way to add the separate losses of the involved individuals, There is, special considerations apart, no reason to regard saving the 50 as preferable to saving the 1. Torek offers an example intended to move us toward recognizing the reasonableness of his position. We are to imagine that were you, a total stranger, to agree to undergo some pain of significant intensity, I would be spared a lesser pain. It is difficult to imagine how I could reasonably bid you to consent. But now imagine that we introduce many more persons who will be spared relatively trivial pain if you will but agree to suffer in our stead. This changes nothing in Torek's view. If not one of us can give you a good reason why you should be willing to undergo a greater suffering so that he might be spared a lesser one, then there is simply no good reason why you should be asked to suffer so that the group may be spared. Suffering is not additive in this way. The discomfort of each of a large number of individuals experiencing a minor headache does not add up to anyone's experiencing a migraine. In such a trade-off situation as this, we are to compare your pain or your loss not to our collective pain or total pain, whatever exactly that is supposed to be, but to what will be suffered or lost by any single one of us. What Torek says about pain is correct, but it adds nothing to his case. The aggregate of trivial pain experienced by many harms no one, while the pain you are asked to endure, some pain of significant intensity, prima facie will harm you. This is what makes the pain example radically disanalogous to the mine cave-in case. In the latter, in contrast to the pain example, we are not being asked to choose between options, one of which will harm an innocent, the other of which won't. Rather, we are being asked to choose between options, all of which will harm some innocents, and harm each in a prima facie comparable way, namely, by causing his death. What reasons, then, are there for refusing to take seriously in such a situation any notion of the sum of two persons' separate losses? One can see what reasons there are when the losses don't all involve harms, as in Torek's pain example. But when all the options will involve harming the innocent in prima facie comparable ways, why can we not intelligibly aggregate the harms that will result if, say, we were to choose the option that brought about the deaths of the 50 miners? It is not clear that Torek has given any reason against the intelligibility of doing so. Possibly Torek thinks something like the following. Even if we could aggregate harms or losses, the aggregate harms no one. There is, that is, no aggregate individual, a composite, as it were, of the 50 individual miners who will be harmed if we choose the option that causes the 50 miners to die, an individual who will suffer harm 50 times as great as the harm suffered by the solitary miner if we were to choose the option that resulted in his death. There are only the 51 individual miners, and the loss each will suffer is as great a loss for that individual as the loss that would be suffered by any of the others. To let the numbers count, Torek might think, is to assume that there is this aggregate individual who will suffer 50 times as great a loss as the single miner. But since there is no such individual, we cannot let the numbers count, which is why we ought not to count them. If this is what Torek thinks, he is confused. Aggregated losses make sense without assuming that there is a particular individual who has lost the total sum. If Bert, Don, and Charlie have all invested in Chrysler Corporation, and if all have lost varying sums of money, it does not follow that we can make sense of the total of their losses only by assuming that there is some fourth individual, some aggregate of the three, who has lost the total sum of their separate losses. Their separate losses can be intelligibly summed without assuming this, just as the average of their total losses can be computed without assuming that there is a fifth person, the one who has lost the average, a Borning. There is no reason why the case of aggregating harms must be different in this respect. We can intelligibly ask how much Bert, Don, and Charlie have been harmed by their financial losses, and we can make sense of the claim that the aggregate of their harms is equal to, or greater or lesser than, the aggregate of the harms of other groups of investors, without our having to assume that there is some other individual, the composite of the three of them, who has experienced the aggregate harm. Perhaps Torek might concede that it is possible to aggregate harms in the way suggested, but deny that we should do this. The prohibition against doing this is a second thread in his argument, albeit one that is not always kept distinct from his implying that we can't. His position in this regard comes to this. To treat all the minors equally, we must have an equal concern for the survival of each of them. But to have an equal concern for each minor requires that we not let the numbers count. If my concern for the one minor's survival is equal to my concern for each of the 50, then I must treat them all equitably, and to treat them all equitably requires that I give all an equal chance in the lottery of survival, so to speak, which, in Torek's view, requires flipping a coin. This approach is unsatisfactory for at least 3 different reasons. First, to flip a coin just once in such cases is manifestly not to treat all the affected individuals equitably. The odds are stacked unfairly in favor of the 1 and against the 50. To make recourse to coin tossing equitable, one would have to flip a coin at least 50 times, 1 toss for each of the 50 minors, over and against the single minor. Indeed, to treat the several members of the group of 50 as if they constituted a single individual, which is what we would be doing if we allowed a single coin toss to decide their collective fate, is itself dramatically at odds with Torek's injunction to take their individual prospective losses seriously. Second, the circumstances of the mine case are such that, even were we to flip the coin so as to treat all involved equitably, there would be no reasonable way to carry out the results. Suppose that, after we have tossed the coin 50 times, the results are as chance would predict. The solitary miner wins 50% of the tosses, while 25 of the 50 miners win the rest. What shall we do? The nature of the case prohibits our saving the 25 without killing the 1. And if we were to save the 1 on the grounds that he won 50% of the tosses, we cannot do this without taking steps that are certain to kill the 25 miners who beat the solitary miner in head-to-head competition, so to speak. Shall we flip a coin again, with everything riding on the outcome? Heads, the solitary miner is saved. Tails, the others perish. But this response will be open to the same objections raised against the initial arrangement. It is not to treat all involved equitably because it gives an unfair advantage to the lone miner. But third, it is false that, by opting to save the 50 rather than the 1, we fail to treat the trapped men equitably, when equality of treatment is interpreted in terms of the respect principle. What each of the miners is entitled to is the same respect due to each as a possessor of inherent value, and this is something we succeed in doing, for reasons soon to be set forth, by saving the 50 at the expense of the 1. 8.10. The Minoride and Worse-Off Principles. Despite the criticisms lodged against Torek's view, there is an important insight contained in it. One way to decide if and when it is permissible to harm those who are innocent is as follows. What we must do is act so as to minimize the total aggregate of harm of the innocent, the minimize harm principle. Thus, whenever we find ourselves in a situation where all of the options at hand will produce some harm to those who are innocent, we must choose that option that will result in the least total sum of harm. The minimize harm principle runs afoul of our considered beliefs. Imagine this prevention case. We may harm A quite radically, or we may harm 1,000 others in a modest way, or we may do nothing, in which case both A and the 1,000 will be harmed as described. Suppose we could place numerical values on the harms in question. A's harm equals, say, minus 125. The aggregate of the 1,000, each of whom will be harmed at a value of minus 1, is minus 1,000. And the aggregate of both, then, is minus 1,125. All are innocent. Which alternative ought we to choose? If we are to decide these matters on the basis recommended by the minimize harm principle, what we ought to do is harm A. And that seems grossly unfair. The quality of his life, after all, would be in a shambles if we chose that option, whereas the welfare of the others, considered as individuals, would only be modestly diminished. What we ought to do is spare A gross harm and spread the harm around by choosing the second option. Now, if that is what we ought to do, we must resist the minimize harm principle. But because appeals to our considered beliefs are controversial, one would like to be able to invalidate this principle without making such appeals. Torek's argument against the possibility of aggregating harms can be understood. It is not clear that he intended it this way, as an attempt to unseat that principle without appealing to our intuitions. If harms cannot be aggregated, then we have solid reasons to reject the minimize harm principle. But it is possible to reject this principle without accepting Torek's arguments for doing so, and without merely appealing to our considered beliefs. The grounds for rejecting it are to be found by working out the implications of the respect principle and the postulate of inherent value on which it rests. The minimize harm principle is a consequentialist principle, one that instructs us to act so as to avoid the worst consequences, where the worst consequences are understood as the greatest sum of harm done to all the innocents affected by the outcome. To accept the minimize harm principle thus is to assume that moral agents or patients are mere receptacles after all, not of, say, pleasures and pains, but of harms and benefits, so that the harm done to any one individual can be more than compensated for by the greater sum of harm that is thereby spared others. The rights view refuses to regard moral agents and patients in this way. Individuals who have inherent values are not to be viewed as mere receptacles of anything, and so may never be treated in ways that assume that they are. To treat them so is to fail to treat them with that respect to which, as possessors of inherent value, they are entitled as a matter of strict justice, treatment to which they have a basic moral right. The fundamental error of the minimize harm principle, then, is not that it assumes that the separate harms of different individuals can be aggregated. They can, Torek's objections to the contrary notwithstanding, or that it has implications that clash with our considered beliefs, though it does. Its fundamental error lies in assuming that moral agents and patients are mere receptacles of value, having no distinctive value in their own right. That is why this principle has implications that fail to match our considered beliefs. To reject the minimize harm principle is not enough. If the rights view is to have any claim on our rational assent, it must be able to provide guidance in precisely those sorts of cases where one might be tempted to rely on the minimize harm principle prevention cases. That is, where, for example, we are required to choose between harming the few or harming the many who are innocent. The rights view recognizes two principles that apply to such cases, both of which are derivable from the respect principle. To prepare the grounds for this derivation requires recalling some of the results of the earlier analysis of harm. Comparable harm. In that earlier analysis, a distinction was drawn between those harms that are inflictions and those that are deprivations. Harms that are deprivations deny an individual opportunities for doing what will bring satisfaction when it is in that individual's interest to do this. Harms that are inflictions diminish the quality of an individual's life, not just if or as they deprive that individual of opportunities for satisfaction, though they usually will do this, but because they detract directly from the individual's overall welfare. Debilitating suffering is the paradigm of a harm that is an infliction. Harms that are deprivations include limitations on one's autonomy. Whatever the category, not all harms are equal. An untimely death, for example, is a prima facie greater harm than a temporary loss of freedom, and it is a prima facie greater harm because it marks a prima facie greater loss. But harms can be unequal not only when the same individual is harmed in different ways, they may also be unequal when different individuals are harmed in the same way. The untimely death of a woman in the prime of her life is, prima facie, a greater harm than the death of her senile mother. Though both lose their life, the magnitude of the loss, and thus the harm suffered by the younger woman, is prima facie greater. It is a virtue of the earlier discussion of harm that it allows us to make distinctions between the magnitude or severity of harms. A related virtue is that it enables us to give content to the notion of comparable harm. Two harms are comparable when they detract equally from an individual's welfare, or from the welfare of two or more individuals. For example, separate episodes of suffering of a certain kind and intensity are comparable harms if they cause an equal diminution in the welfare of the same individual at different times, or in two different individuals at the same or different times. And death is a comparable harm if the loss of opportunities it marks are equal in any two cases. Because of individual variability, however, some things that harm some may not harm others, or may not harm them equally. In the case of physical pain, for example, some people can endure more than others, and some people who suffer can in time come to see this as a blessing in disguise, while others have their lives shattered as a result. We cannot, therefore, automatically assume that prima facie harms of the same kind will necessarily constitute comparable harm in any two cases. What we may assume is that there is a strong presumption that they will. Other things being equal, that is, it is reasonable to assume that like harms have like effects, that is, detract equally from individual welfare, and so are to be counted as comparable. Moreover, there is a limit to how much harm suffered by someone may be morally attributable to others. If you have grown accustomed to walking through a neighboring field on your way to work, and if I purchase the field and fence it, thereby requiring you to walk around it, which in turn requires that you rise earlier and take longer to go to work, then you are no doubt inconvenienced by what I do, and let us agree prima facie harmed by it. But how much you make of this modest inconvenience is your affair, not mine. If you are driven to distraction by the extra time, lose sleep over it, divorce your wife, and burn down my house, ruining your career and spending time in prison in the bargain, then it is preposterous to hold me morally responsible for the heavy dose of harm that has fallen your way. My decision to erect the fence is causally linked to your downfall, and I must take moral responsibility for making the decision I've made. But it does not follow that I should be held accountable for your making a greater harm out of a lesser one. When, therefore, the rights view speaks of harming individuals in prima facie comparable ways, and of the agents having to take responsibility for doing this, it does not imply that the agent must also take responsibility for another's making that harm, as a result of his own volition, into something greater than it is. The Minoride Principle. By making use of the notion of comparable harm, the rights view can formulate two principles that can be appealed to in order to make decisions in prevention cases. The first principle, the minimize overriding principle, or the Minoride principle, states the following. Special considerations aside, when we must choose between overriding the rights of many who are innocent or the rights of few who are innocent, and when each affected individual will be harmed in a prima facie comparable way, then we ought to choose to override the rights of the few in preference to overriding the rights of the many. This principle is derivable from the respect principle. This latter principle entails that all moral agents and patients are directly owed the prima facie duty not to be harmed, and that all those who are owed this duty have an equally valid claim, and thus an equal prima facie moral right against being harmed. Now, precisely because this right is equal, no one individual's right can count for any more than any other's, when the harm that might befall either is prima facie comparable. Thus, A's right cannot count for more than B's or C's or D's. However, when we are faced with choosing between options, one of which will harm A, the other of which will harm B, C, and D, and the third of which will harm them all, and when the foreseeable harm involved for each individual is prima facie comparable, then numbers count. Precisely because each is to count for one, no one for more than one, we cannot count choosing to override the rights of B, C, and D as neither better nor worse than choosing to override A's right alone. Three are more than one, and when the four individuals have an equal prima facie right not to be harmed, when the harm they face is prima facie comparable, and when there are no special considerations at hand, then showing equal respect for the equal rights of the individuals involved requires that we override the right of A, the few, rather than the rights of the many, B, C, D. To choose to override the rights of the many in this case would be to override an equal right 3 times, that is, in the case of 3 different individuals, when we could choose to override such a right only once, and that cannot be consistent with showing equal respect for the equal rights of all the individuals involved. To favor overriding the rights of the few in no way contravenes the requirement that each is to count for one, no one for more than one. On the contrary, special considerations apart, to choose to override the rights of the many rather than those of the few would be to count A's right for more than one, that is, as being equal to overriding the rights of 3 relevantly similar individuals. Accordingly, because we must not allow any one individual a greater voice in the determination of what ought to be done than any other relevantly similar individual, what we ought to do in prevention cases of the sort under consideration is choose to override the rights of the fewest innocents rather than override the rights of the many. And since this is precisely what the Minoride principle enjoins, that principle is derivable from the respect principle. 2 objections to this derivation can be anticipated. Since A's right is equal to B's and to C's and to D's, it might be claimed, then A's right must be equal to the rights of A, B, and C taken together. Therefore, this objection contends to favor doing what will harm A in preference of what will harm B, C, and D is not to let each count for one, no one for more than one. The reply to this objection is in some ways reminiscent of earlier criticisms lodged against Torek. The essential point is a simple one. There is no aggregate individual, no composite of B, C, and D, who has a right not to be harmed, and this for the quite simple reason that there is no aggregate individual in the first place. There are only the separate, distinct individuals, B, C, D, and each of these individuals has a right equal to the right of A. What we are faced with, then, is having to choose not between overriding A's right or overriding the equal right of this composite individual, but between overriding A's right or overriding the equal rights of 3 other separate, distinct individuals. To treat the 3 as one, as if they constituted a single conglomerate individual with the same equal right as A, not only is not required in order to give significance to the idea that each individual has an individual right not to be harmed, but is also contrary to the requirement to treat each of the affected individuals equally. The second objection takes a different tack. It claims that the Minoride principle is at odds with the respect principle because it allows us to treat the few who are innocent merely as receptacles, something the respect principle will not tolerate. Since by choosing to override A's right, we thereby prevent a much greater aggregate of harm befalling B, C, and D, it is claimed, to allow A's right to be overridden is to imply that A's losses are not as bad as this aggregate, which is why A's right may be overridden. And this, so this objection urges, is to treat A as a mere receptacle in just the same way and for just the same reasons as A is treated as a mere receptacle according to the minimize harm principle, a principle which, it was argued previously, must be rejected if one accepts the respect principle. Thus, if one accepts the respect principle, one must reject the Minoride principle. This objection confuses considerations about the foreseeable consequences of acting in compliance with the Minoride principle with the rights views grounds for accepting this principle. It is true that the aggregate of harm that will result when the rights of the few who are innocent are overridden in preference to those of the many is foreseeably less bad, that is, constitutes a less aggregate sum of harm, than that would result if the rights of the many were overridden in preference of those of the few. But the reason for choosing the former option, according to the rights view, is not that the aggregated consequences of making this choice would be better, that is, less bad, That would be to view the individuals involved as mere receptacles. The reason the rights view gives for choosing to override the rights of the few is that this is what we must do if we are to show equal respect for the equal inherent value and the equal prima facie rights of the individuals involved. It is, in a word, not the aggregate consequences for all affected by the outcome that matter. It is respect for the equality of the involved individuals that does. The Minoride principle illuminates why, on the rights view, we ought to act to save the 50 minors rather than the one. Earlier discussions of that example tacitly assumed that the harm each of the minors would suffer if he died is comparable to the harm that any other minor would suffer. That is a reasonable assumption to make, given that their losses are prima facie comparable. This much granted, and assuming that no special considerations are at hand, the Minoride principle requires doing what must be done to save the many, even if this means overriding the rights of the few. And it requires this not because the aggregate of the harms that would result from this choice would be less bad than if we chose to act otherwise. It requires this because this is the choice we must make if we are to show equal respect for the inherent value of the individuals involved, and if we are to count their equal rights equally. The worse-off principle. The fundamental difference between the rights view and the minimize harm principle comes into sharper focus when we turn to consider prevention cases where harms are not comparable. Recall the earlier prevention case where we are called upon to choose between harming A quite radically, minus 125, or harming 1,000 individuals modestly, minus 1 each, or doing nothing. If the only consideration relevant to deciding such cases is to minimize the number of rights that are overridden, then what we ought to do is harm A, since one individual is fewer than 1,000 and 1,001. But the Minoride principle does not enjoin us simply to minimize the number of rights that are overridden. It enjoins us to do this on the assumption that, special considerations aside, the harms faced by all the innocents are prima facie comparable. In the example just given, however, the harms are not prima facie comparable. The harm A faces greatly exceeds the harm faced by any one of the 1,000, and the aggregate of the harm that would befall the 1,000 harms no one individual and thus cannot be construed as constituting harm that is comparable to, or more than comparable to, the harm that would befall A. The minimize harm principle would require choosing the option that harms A. The Minoride principle, since it applies only in prevention cases where harms are prima facie comparable, cannot be relied on in cases such as this one, where the harm all the innocents face is not prima facie comparable. The rights view thus requires a second principle, distinct from but not consistent with the Minoride principle, and one that is distinct from and not reducible to the minimize harm principle. The following principle, the worse-off principle, meets these requirements. The following formulation is given in terms of the rights of the many and the rights of the few. However, unequal numbers, the few, the many, are not essential to the worse-off principle. It applies in cases where we must choose between harming one innocent or harming another. Such cases are considered in the next section. It also applies when we act to prevent ourselves from being made worse off. On this, see 9.11. Special considerations aside, when we must decide to override the rights of the many or the rights of the few who are innocent, and when the harm faced by the few would make them worse off than any of the many would be if any other option were chosen, then we ought to override the rights of the many. Unlike the Minoride principle, the worse-off principle applies to the type of prevention case illustrated by the example at hand. And unlike the minimize harm principle, the worse-off principle would not sanction overriding A's right, because doing so brought about a lesser aggregate of harm. The worse-off principle sanctions overriding the rights of the 1,000, even though each is innocent, and even though, by overriding their individual rights, we override the right of 1,000 innocent individuals not to be harmed in preference to overriding the right of one individual. In this kind of case, in short, numbers don't count. The worse-off principle, like the Minoride principle, is derivable from the respect principle. Notice, first, that the respect principle cannot allow harming A on the grounds that the 1,000 will be spared a greater aggregate amount of harm. To suppose that the harm done to A can be justified in this way is to treat A as a mere receptacle. It is to assume, that is, that A's losses can be outweighed by the sum of the losses of the others. The respect principle will not allow this. If we are to treat A with the respect A is due as a matter of strict justice, we cannot simply sum A's losses and then compare them with the aggregate total of the losses of the 1,000, except at the price of ignoring the distinctive kind of value, inherent value, A has. The approach to decision-making affirmed by the minimize harm principle is denied by the respect principle. Appeal to the respect principle will not justify choosing an option that makes the few individuals involved worse off than any other involved individual would be if any other option were chosen. Appeal to the respect principle justifies overriding the rights of the many in prevention cases of the type at hand. This is shown by considering a simple case first. To say that two individuals, M and N, have an equal right not to be harmed, based on the equal respect each is owed, does not imply that each and every harm either may suffer is equally harmful. Other things being equal, M's death is a greater harm than N's migraine. If we are to show equal respect for the value and rights of individuals, therefore, we cannot count a lesser harm to N as equal to or greater than a greater harm to M. To show equal respect for the equal rights of the two, one must count their equal harms equally, not their unequal harms equally, a requirement that entails, other things being equal in prevention cases, that M's right override N's when the harm done to M would be greater if one choice were made than the harm done to N would be if another option were chosen. To assess the matter otherwise, to flip a coin or to override M's right, would be to give to N more than N is due, precisely because M and N are equal in inherent value, because the two have an equal prima facie right not to be harmed, and because the harm M faces is greater than the harm N faces. Equal respect for the two requires that we not choose to override M's right, but choose to override N's instead. Now, adding numbers makes no difference in such a case. If, as in our earlier example, A would be made worse off than any one of the 1,000 individuals if we chose to harm A and spare the others, then aggregating the harms of the 1,000 can make no difference. No one else is harmed by summing the harms of the 1,000. There is, that is, no aggregate individual whose harm can be placed at minus 1,000, and who can be viewed as having a right not to be harmed that justifiably overrides A's. There are just the 1,000, each one of whom will be harmed less than A will, and no one of whom will be made worse off than A would be if we chose to harm A. For each of the 1,000, then, A's right overrides his, just as in the previous paragraph, M's right justifiably overrides N's. It is the magnitude of the harm done to A and each individual member of the 1,000, not the sum of A's harm compared with the sum of the 1,000s, that determines whose right overrides whose. Since, ex hypothesi, the harm done to A would be greater than that done to and would make A worse off than any other involved individual, respect for the equal rights and value of all those involved requires overriding the rights of the many rather than the right of the individual. In the absence of special considerations, and assuming the few who are innocent would be made worse off than any of the many who are innocent if we chose to override the rights of the few, the respect principle requires that we override the rights of the many. And since this is what the worse-off principle requires, that principle is derivable from the respect principle. An objection to this derivation and to the earlier derivation of the Minoride principle argues that the rights view is inconsistent. On the one hand, the rights view denies the moral relevance of consequences, as witness its steady attack on utilitarianism and its rejection of the minimize harm principle. And yet, on the other hand, it relies on the notion of comparable harm and invokes considerations about who will be harmed most, as witness its minoride and worse-off principles. And this, so the objection goes, is inconsistent. This objection is a product of confusion. What the rights view denies is that moral right and wrong can be determined merely by determining which alternative act, or, as in the case of rule utilitarianism, the adoption of which rules will bring about the best aggregate consequences for all those affected by the outcome, even when the best consequences are the least bad, as according to the minimize harm principle they are. The rights view rejects any and all consequentialist theories, because any and all assume that consequences and consequences alone determine moral right, wrong, and duty. But the rights view does not hold that considerations about consequences are morally irrelevant. In particular, it does not claim that we can dispense with such considerations in determining how much those directly involved will be harmed. However, to insist on the relevance of such considerations is not the same as, and does not entail, the belief that aggregating consequences for all those affected by the outcome determines moral right, wrong, and duty. Consequences are relevant because we cannot fix the magnitude of harm for those directly involved without attention to them. Even so, the moral relevance of these consequences is parasitic on moral principles whose validity is not argued for on the grounds that their adoption will bring about better consequences for all those affected by the outcome, utilitarianism, or for those individuals who enter into certain agreements, rational egoism. The validity of the respect principle and those principles derivable from it, the harm principle and the minoride and the worse-off principles, rests on the postulate of inherent value, not on the principle of utility, or on the agreements reached by rational egoists, or on any other consequentialist ethical principle. Indeed, to insist, as the rights view does, that considerations about how much each of those directly involved will be harmed are relevant considerations in prevention cases is precisely what one would expect and should require of a view that advocates the equal rights of the individuals involved. How else are we to show equal respect toward each of these individuals except by considering how well their individual prima facie right not to be harmed stacks up against the equal prima facie right of the other individuals involved? And how are we to determine this without considering which of those individuals directly involved will be harmed, how much each will be harmed, and so forth? To insist on the relevance of these considerations is simply to insist on the necessity of treating all those directly involved with the equal respect they are due. What we must not do, what would be contrary to the letter and the spirit of the rights view, is to sanction overriding an individual's right merely on the grounds that this brings about a better aggregate balance of good over evil for all those affected by the outcome. That would be to authorize treating those who have inherent value merely as a means to this collective goal, and that is prohibited, given the rights view, since it is to treat right-bearers as if they were mere receptacles. Mistaken the rights view may be, only future challenges can decide this, but certainly it is not mistaken because it is inconsistent, at least not for the reasons alleged. The rights view is antagonistic to utilitarianism, even to those utilitarians, such as Mill, who are not acrimonious to appeals to moral rights. It is, in some respects, sympathetic to Torrek's position, especially in denying, in concert with him, the validity of the minimize harm principle. But one can deny the validity of that principle without denying that harms can be aggregated, and without denying that the numbers ever count. The minoride and worse-off principles provide an alternative basis to Torrek's position of denying the minimize harm principle and the general utilitarian inclination with which that principle is naturally allied. An alternative that is decidedly non-utilitarian and can only mistakenly be regarded as consequentialist. Moreover, these principles, for the reasons given above, are not independent or disconnected principles, not self-evident moral axioms, not self-evident moral laws, not self-evident moral absolutes. They are principles that can be derived from a still more fundamental principle, the respect principle, a principle that itself can be defended by means of argument rather than by appeals to what is claimed to be self-evident. None of these principles, including Minorite and worse off, are ad hoc devices tailor-made to fit some favored set of considered beliefs. To dispute the rights view just on these grounds would be as unfair as it would be unfounded. 8.11. Why side effects don't count. The rights view categorically denies that side effects are relevant considerations for determining when it is justifiable to override the right of the innocent not to be harmed. In denying the moral relevance of side effects, the rights view differs fundamentally from all consequentialist theories. For act utilitarians, for example, whether it is wrong to kill or otherwise harm an innocent individual must depend on the consequences of doing so, not only for the individual who is killed, but for everyone affected by the outcome. Since the side effects of any given action, that is, how others who are not directly involved are affected by the outcome, are part of the consequences of the action, side effects are relevant to the moral assessment of the action, according to act utilitarianism, and are just as relevant as the effects the action has on the individuals directly involved. Since each is to count for one and no one for more than one, directly involved individuals have no privileged moral position within utilitarian theory. And this is so regardless of the kind of act utilitarian theory we are presented. For example, hedonistic utilitarianism, preference utilitarianism, etc. The rights view will not allow this. To suppose that we can justify harming an innocent individual merely by aggregating the consequences for all those affected by the outcome is to treat that individual as if he were a receptacle, and thus is contrary to the respect to which, as a possessor of inherent value, he is due as a matter of strict justice. If his right not to be harmed is to be overridden, it cannot be overridden merely on the grounds that doing so is necessary to produce optimal consequences for everyone. This is why the secrecy of the killing of a moral agent makes no difference to its justifiability for the rights view, though it does for the act utilitarian. The radical difference between the rights view and consequentialist theories, for example, act utilitarianism, can be illustrated in the following way. Imagine we are in a situation where we must choose between doing what will harm one innocent individual, A, or doing what will harm another innocent individual, B. Imagine further that were we to choose the first option, A would be harmed much more severely than B would be harmed were we to choose the latter option. Suppose A would be paralyzed for life, B for a day. And imagine, finally, that it so happens that there are interested parties in B's case, but not in A's. That is, there are individuals who care about what happens to B, but none who care about A, so that if the choice is made to do what will harm B, these interested parties will not like it. How shall we decide what we ought to do? On act utilitarian grounds, we cannot ignore the side effects harming B will have on these interested parties. On the contrary, we must consider their interests and count them equitably. That much conceded, it could well be that when all the consequences are counted and weighed, the aggregate of the consequences that would result from choosing to do what harms A could be less bad than those that would result from choosing to harm B. And if that were true, harming A is what we ought to do, given act utilitarianism. The rights view will not allow this. If, as we assume, the harm done to A makes A worse off than B, then, special considerations aside, it is wrong to override A's right not to be harmed. The aggregate of the harms of others harms no one in particular in a way comparable to the way A would be harmed, and to suppose that A's harm could be justified by totaling the harms of B and those interested in B is to view A as a mere receptacle, something that, on the rights view, he is not. In general, When we must choose among options, all of which will cause harm to some who are innocent and one of which will make a given individual worse off than the others, then, special considerations aside, we must not choose this latter option. That is what the worse-off principle requires when applied to cases where we must choose which one of two different individuals to harm. When properly understood, it is the rights view, not utilitarianism, that provides the philosophical basis for principled objections to the worst forms of moral prejudice, such as racism. In their paradigmatic form, moral prejudices consist in supposing that making certain individuals worse off than others can be justified by appealing to side effects. For example, to the interests of others affected by the outcome. The racist, for example, is more than willing to allow that blacks be made worse off because he and his ilk like whites more than they like blacks. Because, given utilitarian theory, the racist's pleasures, preferences, and so forth count and must be counted equitably. And because, given this theory, we must aim to bring about the best aggregate result, utilitarianism is not, in principle, inhospitable to racism. The rights view bars its entrance. It will not allow the aggregate balance of goods over evils for all affected by the outcome to justify harming anyone, least of all making any individual worse off than others. Let the racists aggregate their collective gains and losses to their heart's content. That will go no way toward justifying what they do to individual members of the victimized group, when these individuals are made worse off than any other individual affected by the outcome. The same is true of speciesism. Those harms done to animals cannot be justified by appeals to the optimal aggregate balance of goods over evils obtained by others. To suppose otherwise is to assume that those animals who, as individuals, are made worse off can have their harmful inflictions or deprivations morally offset by summing the goods and evils others obtain or avoid. And this is something that cannot be done unless we view these animals as mere receptacles. An erroneous assumption given the rights view and the postulate of inherent value on which it rests. Thus do we have, on the rights view, the basis utilitarians lack for protesting against, for example, those who would use animals in terminal research, but not humans, when the death caused these animals marks a greater loss and thus a greater harm than it would in the case of some humans who might be used in their place. For the magnitude of the harm that death is a function of the number and variety of opportunities for satisfaction it forecloses, and there is no credible basis on which to claim that the death of a normal adult animal is not a greater loss and thus a greater harm than the death of a less aware, impaired human, one who possesses fewer desires, less competence to act intentionally, and is less responsive to others and to the environment generally. Utilitarians, because they insist on the relevance of side effects, imply that it is permissible to override the rights of the animal rather than the human in such cases, if the aggregate total consequences for everyone affected by the outcome would be better than those that would result if the human's rights were overridden. That being so, utilitarians cannot lodge a moral complaint, justified by reference to the principle of utility, against using the animal in research unless they are in possession of facts that show that the use of the animal is not optimific, all considered. Significantly, utilitarians are not in possession of the relevant facts. See in 6.4, the argument given there which applies to the utilitarian basis for the obligatoriness of vegetarianism applies with equal force to the question of the use of animals in science. The rights view does not need these facts to lodge its moral protest against speciesist practices. It is not the aggregate balance of goods and evils for all those affected by the outcome that is decisive. It is the magnitude of the harm done to the individuals directly involved that is. Special considerations aside, to persist in using animals in terminal research, when the magnitude of the harm that death is for them is greater than it would be for an impaired human, is speciesist. And it is a variety of speciesism, ironically, that could be supported by the very theory that has been appealed to denounce this prejudice, namely utilitarianism. But lest it be thought that the rights view's position on the use of animals and humans in terminal or other research is an invitation to begin to use less fortunate human beings in lieu of animals, let it be clear that the use of human beings, like the use of animals, cannot be defended merely by appealing to aggregate consequences. As moral patients, these human beings are to be protected by the very same principles that apply to our dealings with all who are innocent. The initial attractiveness of utilitarianism as a moral theory on which to rest the call for the better treatment of animals was noted in an earlier context. Because animals are sentient, that is, can experience pleasure and pain, and because they not only have but can act on their preferences, any view that holds that pleasures or pains or preference satisfactions or frustrations matter morally is bound to seem attractive to those in search of the moral basis for the animal rights movement, especially because animals are made to suffer in the pursuit of human purposes, in the name of efficient factory farming, for example, or in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. The utilitarian injunction to count their suffering and to count it equitably must strike a responsive moral chord. But utilitarianism is not the theory its initial reception by the animal rights movement may have suggested. It provides no basis for the rights of animals, and instead contains within itself the grounds for perpetuating the very speciesist practices it was supposed to overthrow. To secure the philosophical foundation for animal rights requires abandoning utilitarianism. 8.12. More objections answered. 3 important criticisms can be anticipated. First, a critic might object that the rights view has implications that clash with our considered beliefs. Imagine that A is a total stranger and B is a family member or friend. And imagine that you must choose between doing something that will harm A or doing something that will harm B, or doing nothing, in which case both will be harmed. Suppose that the harm A faces is of slightly greater magnitude than the harm B faces, though both harms are significant. Then the rights view, it might be claimed, implies that you ought to act to spare the stranger at the expense of your loved one, and that is counterintuitive. Now, that result is counterintuitive, and any view would do well to avoid it. But it is critical to avoid it for the right reasons. In particular, appeals to side effects are again inappropriate. It would be a mistake to argue as follows. The reason why you ought not to harm your loved one is because, if you do, the aggregate of his harm plus the harm that would befall you, for example, your mental anguish, doubt, and guilt, if you chose to harm him, would be greater than the sum of the harm that would result if you chose to harm the stranger. It would be a mistake to make the decision in this case turn on such considerations because, 1, it would be to treat all the parties involved, the stranger, your loved one, and yourself, as if all were mere receptacles of value, and because, 2, to let side effects count in this case would open the door to letting them count in any case where others have an interest in the outcome. And that would be to allow any interested third party to add his losses to the losses of the one he likes, and then appeal to this greater aggregate to justify making the one he does not like worse off. This would give the bigot and the fanatic, for example, the very opening they need to justify their bigotry and fanaticism. An alternative to this aggregate approach is to view the moral bonds between family members and friends as a special consideration that justifiably can override the otherwise binding application of the Minoride and worse-off principles. This is not a case of a theory's grasping at straws to save itself. It is preposterous to suppose that the reason why I have special obligations to my wife, children, other family members, and friends is because of the salutary side effects this has for others, least of all for society generally. I stand in a special moral relationship to friends and family because I stand in a special personal relationship to them, and though neither relationship quite fits the model of an explicit contract, we don't, that is, actually sit down and write out the terms of our relationship, The relationship between loved ones is not totally disanalogous to contractual arrangements either. Like contracts, relationships between loved ones are built on mutual trust, interdependence, and the performance of mutually beneficial acts. Normally, it is those closest to us whom we stand to help or harm most, and they us. It would therefore be morally odious to require that we suspend the moral bonds that characterize these relationships whenever someone who stands outside these relationships will be made slightly worse off if we decide to prevent harm to someone who occupies a position within such a relationship. For example, a friend. To say this is not to say that there are no possible circumstances in which we ought to be willing to do what will harm a loved one in order to prevent harm befalling a stranger. If the magnitude of the harms in question vary greatly, say it is a question of preventing the death of a stranger or a minor injury to a friend, then loyalty to one's friend, that is, that type of special consideration, ought to be set aside, and the normal application of the worse-off principle honored. Were one's friend not to understand this, claiming that duties to one's friends override everything else, then one would do well to look elsewhere for one's friends. The issues obviously admit of indefinite degrees and call for judgment in some cases where it would be unreasonable to hope for an ironclad, exceptionless rule on which to base them. The rights view has no such rule, and in this it shares its limitations with all theories vying for our informed assent. Having said this, however, the central point remains. The relationships between friends and loved ones are special, and so should be counted among those special considerations that can validly suspend the normal application of the Minoride and worse-off principles. That is the reason why, in most cases at least, we are justified in sparing significant harm to our friends, even when doing so will make a stranger worse off. The justification of our acting as we do does not consist in totaling our friends and our own losses. These remarks on acquired duties provide the occasion for resolving an issue that was raised in passing in an earlier context. The issue concerns when, and if so, how, the validity of putative acquired duties and their correlative rights is to be decided. The rights view's position is as follows. Those who reach unjust voluntary agreements or who take part in unjust institutions, for example, the slave trade, acquire no duties, nor does anyone acquire moral rights, as a result of voluntary participation in such an institution or as a result of the agreements reached by those who perpetuate the institution. As those affected by these agreements and the institution, in this case, the slaves, are not treated with the respect they are due according to the rights view, the institution is unjust, and the putative duties and rights acquired by those who perpetuate it lack moral validity. Lacking this validity, they fail to qualify as valid moral considerations that would justify suspending the normal application of the Minoride or worse-off principles. If the choice faced by a slave trader in a prevention case was between either harming a slave significantly or harming a fellow trader less so, then it is the fellow trader who ought to be harmed, not the slave. The appeal to any contract made between the slave traders as constituting a special consideration, lacking any claim to validity in this case. Since the institution of which the contract is a part is unjust to the core, the contract has no valid moral status. On the rights view, then, appeals to acquired duties can play a legitimate role in the determination of what ought to be done if and only if these putative duties qualify as valid duties, and these are those duties that meet the requirement of just treatment as specified by the respect principle. If this requirement is met, then one's voluntary acts and one's place in an institution are the basis for acquiring both duties and rights. A promise voluntarily made thus creates both the acquired duty on the part of the promisor to perform as promised, and the correlative right on the part of the one to whom the promise is made to claim performance as being due, if both those who enter into the agreement and those affected by it are treated with the respect that is their due. One has no moral duty to do what violates the rights of another, in other words, even if one promises to do so, and the one to whom the promise is made has no acquired moral right to require performance, as when, for example, a professional killer contracts to murder a public-spirited special prosecutor. Only when the agreements reached as a result of a promise or a contract satisfy the respect principle do the participants acquire moral duties and correlative moral rights. When that condition is met, the rights and duties are validated. This is how, according to the rights view, the duty to keep a promise, for example, is validated. The requirement that voluntary acts and institutions conform with the respect principle if they are to give rise to valid moral duties and correlative rights explains why, on the rights view, all attempts to base morality on the agreements reached by self-interested individuals, for example, Narvasanian rational egoism or Rawlsian contractarianism, must prove to be deficient. Agreements or contracts are morally valid, according to the rights view, if and only if they satisfy the requirement of just treatment, as specified by the respect principle, and the validity of that principle is not itself dependent on who reaches what agreements or under what conditions they reach them, for example, from behind the veil of ignorance. To put the point alternatively, the moral validity of the agreements or contracts reached must be shown by appeal to a principle that is not itself a product of the contract or agreement. In this way, the arbitrary exclusion of moral patience from those who are owed direct duties, including the unacquired duty of just treatment, an exclusion that characterizes all contractarian theories, is traced to its ultimate source. For since on such views the principles of just treatment are themselves the outcome of the contract, and since only those capable of contracting can be owed strict justice, these theories imply that those who are themselves incapable of contracting may be non-arbitrarily excluded from those to whom strict justice is owed. Thus are moral patients, whether humans or animals, excluded. The rights view denies this. The validity of the respect principle as a principle of just treatment is independent of contractarian considerations, and the scope of this principle includes all those who may reasonably be viewed as possessing inherent value, including animals and those human moral patients like them in the relevant respects. Abortion and infanticide. A second objection contests the rights view because of its alleged implications regarding abortion and infanticide. Since individuals who are not subjects of a life are not recognized as having rights, according to the rights view, and since neither human fetuses nor newborn infants are subjects of a life, it follows, so this objection urges, that neither fetuses nor infants have rights. And from this it follows, so it is alleged, that the rights view implies that we may do anything we please to human fetuses and infants. Since no moral theory can be adequate if it has this implication, however, the rights view is not the adequate theory its advocates suppose. A number of replies deserve mention. Recall first that the rights view advances the subject of a life criterion as a sufficient, not a necessary, condition for possessing inherent value and, by implication, basic moral rights. Even assuming, then, that neither human fetuses nor infants satisfy this criterion, it does not follow that they must lack moral rights. Whether they do remains an open question given the rights view, just as whether natural objects, trees or sagebrush, for example, possess rights remains an open question given this view. Second, recall that the rights view does not deny that human fetuses and infants fail to satisfy the subject of a life criterion. At an earlier point, the decision was made to limit the use of the word human to Homo sapiens of 1 year or more who are not very seriously mentally impoverished. That decision was made so that the discussion could proceed without our first having to decide where to draw the line concerning when individual humans acquire or lose the family of mental abilities that makes one the subject of a life in the sense explained. It was acknowledged at that point that the status of human fetuses and infants in this regard is controversial, It is not obviously true that the newly born or the soon-to-be-born have beliefs, desires, and the like, and neither is it obviously true that they lack these mental attributes. Whether they do or do not, in short, is an open and much debated question. Though it is beyond the scope of the present work to enter into this debate, it should be clear that the rights view leaves the question central to this debate an open question, and that is a virtue, not a vice of this view. Third, even assuming that human fetuses and infants, despite our abundant ignorance concerning their relative mental development, in fact are not subjects of a life and, let us suppose, also lack moral rights, it would not follow that the rights view implies that we are at liberty to do anything we please to them. The rights view advocates taking steps that foster the creation of a moral climate where the rights of the individual are taken seriously indeed. Better, then, to adopt a policy that errs on the side of caution when the recognition of moral rights is at issue. Precisely because it is unclear where we should draw the line between those humans who are and those who are not subjects of a life, and in view of our profound ignorance about the comparative mental sophistication of newly born and soon-to-be-born human beings, the rights view would advocate giving infants and viable human fetuses the benefit of the doubt, viewing them as if they are subjects of a life, as if they have basic moral rights, even while conceding that in viewing them in these ways, we may be giving them more than is their due. This argument for enfranchising newly born and soon-to-be-born human beings into the class of rights holders does not appeal to the sentimental interests of parents, relatives, or other third parties. For a critique of the appeal to sentimental interests in this connection, see the earlier discussion of Narveson, 5.3. It is the importance of fostering an environment in which individual rights are respected, whatever people's sentiments, that underpins the serious moral protection extended to newly born and soon-to-be-born human beings. To specify the implications of the rights view regarding the full range of cases involving abortion and infanticide, in particular to explore the possible conflicts between the rights of fetuses, infants, and others, is well beyond the limited reach of the present work. But what has been said here is enough to indicate why, contrary to the criticism under review, the rights view does not imply that we may do anything we please to human fetuses and infants. Obligatory and supererogatory acts. The third and final objection to be considered in the present section challenges the rights view from a different quarter, arguing that this view, in particular the worse-off principle, implies that supererogatory acts are strict duties. This objection takes the following form. Suppose a race car driver has been involved in a terrible accident and is certain to die if the available medical personnel are not used to save him. Suppose that 4 other patients need the services of the personnel, that all could be adequately treated only if none of the staff is diverted to the driver, and that all 4 will be significantly harmed. For example, 1 will lose an arm, a second will be partially paralyzed, etc., though none will die, if efforts are made to save the driver. Since the rights view will not allow aggregating harms of different individuals as a way of deciding what to do, one who accepts this view cannot claim that the 4 should be treated because the sum of their harms would exceed the harm borne by the lone driver. Indeed, since the worse-off principle directs us to prevent making the individual worse off, special considerations aside, that principle, it might be claimed, requires that we override the rights of the 4 and administer to the needs of the driver, and that the 4, recognizing the valid application of this principle in this case, ought to concur, agreeing to endure their respective harms so that the driver might be spared his. And this, so this objection alleges, is the rights view's undoing. For though it would be a remarkable show of self-sacrifice for the 4 to agree to bear their respective harms, so that the driver might be spared his, it is preposterous to claim or imply that the 4 ought to do so, that each has a duty in this regard. For them voluntarily to endure their significant harms would be above and beyond the call of duty, would, that is, be supererogatory. Yet the rights view implies otherwise. It implies that each has a duty to do so. The rights view's reply, again, turns on taking due note of the special considerations aside proviso incorporated in both the Minoride and worse-off principles. That proviso does make a difference in many cases, including the present one. The essential point to notice is that those who voluntarily engage in high-risk behavior, including auto racing, obviously choose to expose themselves to certain risks that those who abstain from such activities choose to forego. And it is part of the unspoken rules that apply to those embarked on such behavior that those who abstain cannot reasonably be required to suffer appreciable harm in the name of justice, so that those who take additional risks might be rescued from their plight when the risk materializes. Those who voluntarily engage in high-risk behavior, in other words, waive their right not to be made worse off if the means used to save them appreciably harms others who are not engaged in such activity. This is not to deny that those who are uninvolved are free to make the sacrifice to save the risk-taker. It is only to deny that the risk-taker has a valid claim, and thus a right, against them to do so, or that they have a correlative duty to make this sacrifice. If they should decide to make the sacrifice, they would act above and beyond what duty requires, whereas if they decide not to, they could not be faulted for failing to discharge their duty. The rights view is able to account for supererogatory acts without abandoning either the minoride or the worse-off principle, and it can do so without having recourse to aggregating harms for different individuals, and thus without violating the respect principle. The reason why the rights of those who are not involved in high-risk behavior should not be overridden to spare those who engaged in such behavior from being made worse off is not because the sum of their harm would exceed the harm done to the risk-takers who find themselves in perilous circumstances. It is because those who voluntarily engage in such activity must understand that one of the risks they run is just this, that if or as they find themselves in perilous circumstances as a result of their engaging in such behavior, their right not to be made worse off no longer automatically outweighs the rights of those who choose not to run such risks. Special considerations. The replies given to the first and third objections raised in the present section illustrate two kinds of special consideration recognized by the rights view. First are those that involve acquired duties and rights, both of which arise as a result of either voluntary agreements, for example, promises or contracts, or as a result of one's voluntarily assuming a position within a given institutional structure, for example, taking a job or joining the army. The second class of special considerations involves those who voluntarily engage in certain kinds of activities, including high-risk activity, for example, mountain climbing, and competitive activities, for example, long-distance races. Considerations of the first kind are special, according to the rights view, because they involve valid claims, and thus rights, possessed by specific individuals, rights in addition to the basic moral rights shared by everyone. To treat those who have these special or acquired rights equitably, therefore, requires taking their additional rights into account. Considerations of the second kind are special because those who voluntarily participate in high-risk or competitive activities voluntarily place themselves outside the normal protection afforded by the minoride and worse-off principles. Considerations of the first kind, in short, are considerations that add to the strength of the claims of certain individuals, namely those who have acquired rights, while those of the second kind are special because they subtract from the strength of the claims possessed by others. For example, those who voluntarily participate in high-risk or competitive activities. Both types of considerations will prove to be important when we examine the moral implications of recognizing the rights of animals. A third kind of special consideration involves the historical background leading up to situations where we are called upon to decide whose right not to be harmed should be overridden. If some of those involved are in their present predicament because other involved individuals have violated their basic rights in the past, then these past violations make a moral difference in the application of the minoride and worse-off principles. For example, if the solitary person trapped in the mine shaft was forced into the mine by the 50 because they believed they might reap some benefits from his forced labor, the 50 have lost their claim to be protected by the application of the minoride principle assuming all involved face prima facie comparable harm. Or again, if the lone minor happened to be an orphaned, unloved, impaired slave, while the 50 were highly intelligent, loved, and respected slave owners, the 50 would have no valid claim to the protection afforded by the worse-off principle, despite the greater prima facie harm death would be for each of them when compared to the harm death would be for the enslaved minor. Those who forge, as well as those who perpetuate injustice, are not on the same moral footing as their innocent victims. To put the same point in different words, unless we recognize that one kind of special consideration concerns the past injustice some have had to bear, the Minorite and the worse-off principles would allow the rights of those who perpetuate injustice to override the rights of their victims in the name of justice. No account of justice and individual rights that allows this can be sound. No one has a right to profit from violating the basic rights of others. Those who are parties to such injustice lose the protection the Minorite and worse-off principles provide, and have no just grounds to complain if we override their right not to be harmed and spare the victims of their past injustice. No claim is made here regarding the completeness of the preceding account of special considerations. Even so, it should be clear that side effects can find no place on the list of special considerations. To allow them a place is to assume that individuals who have inherent value are mere receptacles, something the rights view categorically denies. That is why side effects don't count. When there are cases, for example when family members are involved, where the normal application of the Minorite or worse-off principle can be justifiably suspended, the rights view will seek to show that the grounds for doing so are to be found among those considerations that are plausibly and consistently viewed as special considerations. If those who advocate the rights view are unable to show this in a broad range of cases, if it can be shown that the implications of the rights view in these cases fail to match our considered judgments, and if an alternative to the rights view, one that is equal to the rights view in other respects, can be shown to systematize and illuminate these convictions, then the rights view will be faced with a serious problem indeed. Whether those who advocate the rights view are equal to the task of defending it against the challenges raised by others, obviously must await receipt of the challenges themselves. The outcome cannot be determined in advance. What can be said in advance is that, on the rights view, no consideration can qualify as a special consideration if it assumes or implies that we may sum the pleasures and pains, preference satisfactions and frustrations, and the like, of all those who will be affected by the outcome of alternative acts as a way to determine when the Minorite or worse-off principle may be overridden. 8.13 Unfinished Business. Two issues deferred in earlier discussions may now be addressed. The first is the lifeboat case. Recall the situation. There are 5 survivors, 4 normal adults and a dog. The boat has room enough only for 4. Someone must go or else all will perish. Who should it be? Our initial belief is the dog. Can the rights view illuminate and justify this pre-reflective intuition? The preceding discussion of prevention cases shows how it can. All on board have equal inherent value and an equal prima facie right not to be harmed. Now, the harm that death is a function of the opportunities for satisfaction it forecloses, and no reasonable person would deny that the death of any of the 4 humans would be a greater prima facie loss, and thus a greater prima facie harm, than would be true in the case of the dog. Death for the dog, in short, though a harm, is not comparable to the harm that death would be for any of the humans. To throw any one of the humans overboard, to face certain death, would be to make that individual worse off, that is, would cause that individual a greater harm, than the harm that would be done to the dog if the animal was thrown overboard. Our belief that it is the dog who should be killed is justified by appeal to the worse-off principle. The selection of the dog does not conflict with recognizing the animal's equal inherent value or the dog's equal prima facie right not to be harmed. It does not conflict with the former because the animal is not harmed on the grounds that the aggregate of the harm spared the 4 humans as a group outweighs the individual animal's losses. and it does not conflict with the latter because recognition of the equal prima facie right not to be harmed requires that we not count unequal harms equally. To save the dog and to throw any one of the humans overboard would be to give the dog more than is his due. It would be to count the lesser harm done to the dog as equal to or greater than the greater harm that would be done to any of the humans if one of them was cast overboard. Respect for their equal prima facie rights will not allow this. Any one of the humans who volunteered to give his life to save the dogs would be doing more, indeed much more, than duty strictly requires. The lifeboat case would not be morally any different if we supposed that the choice had to be made not between a single dog and the 4 humans, but between these humans and any number of dogs. Let the number of dogs be as large as one likes. Suppose they number 1,000,000, and suppose the lifeboat will support only 4 survivors. Then the rights view still implies that, special considerations apart, the 1,000,000 dogs should be thrown overboard and the 4 humans saved. To attempt to reach a contrary judgment will inevitably involve one in aggregative considerations, the sum of the losses of the 1,000,000 dogs over and against the losses for one of the humans, an approach that cannot be sanctioned by those who accept the respect principle. To decide matters against the 1 or the 1,000,000 dogs is not speciesist. The decision to sacrifice the 1 or the 1,000,000 is not based on species membership. It is based on assessing the losses each individual faces and assessing these losses equitably, an approach that is at once consistent with and required by the recognition of the equal inherent value and the equal prima facie right not to be harmed possessed by all those involved. For similar reasons, deciding against the 1 dog or the 1,000,000 does not commit one to a perfectionist theory of justice. For a discussion of theories of this type, see 7.1. Perfectionist theories sanction the routine subordination of the less virtuous by those who are more virtuous, so that the latter may develop their virtues optimally. The rights view disallows such subordination. What the rights view implies should be done in exceptional cases, and prevention cases, including lifeboat cases, are exceptional cases, cannot fairly be generalized to unexceptional cases. Moreover, lifeboat and other prevention cases, including those discussed earlier, are not decided by appeal to perfectionist principles, according to the rights view. They are decided by appeal to principles that acknowledge and respect the equality of the individuals involved. Both their equal inherent value, no one individual's losses are to be outweighed by summing the losses of any group of individuals, and their equal prima facie right not to be harmed. No one individual's lesser harm can count for more than another's greater harm. This is not perfectionism. A second point deferred in earlier discussions concerns the argument for utilitarianism based on acceptance of conditional equality. That argument, roughly, claims that 1. If we would have others consider our preferences and count them equitably, and 2. If we take the moral point of view, then 3. We will be obliged to favor that outcome that maximizes the balance of preference satisfaction over preference frustration for all those affected by the outcome. In the earlier discussions of this argument, it was noted that it fails to show that anyone who accepts 1 and 2 is committed to utilitarianism, the view that the principle of utility is the sole moral basis of morality. At the very most, it was argued, acceptance of 1 and 2 would commit one to accepting a consequentialist principle. As was also remarked, there are good reasons to resist accepting 1 and 2 in the first place, if one thereby commits oneself to 3. For to accept 3 is to commit oneself to an aggregative principle, a principle whose acceptance would sanction harming some who are innocent if the sum of the consequences for all those affected by the outcome, including all the side effects, happen to constitute a better balance of preference satisfaction over preference frustration than was otherwise obtainable. This view of moral decision-making is pernicious, according to the rights view. It assumes and perpetuates the view that moral agents and patients are mere receptacles of value, having no inherent value of their own. No one who takes rights seriously should accept this aggregative view of moral decision-making or the view of the value of individuals, or rather their lack of value it tacitly assumes without defending. To accept this view is to undermine the very possibility of giving a credible account of the rights of moral agents and patients, for reasons offered at length in the preceding, and it should come as no surprise that those who advance this argument for utilitarianism should disparage appeals to rights as rhetoric. Their starting point predestines that outcome. To show that, rationally considered, we ought not to start our moral thinking where these thinkers do, that is, with our personal preferences, or end where they end, with a principle that allows or requires us to aggregate everyone's benefits and harms, pleasures and pains, etc., has been one of the principal aims of the arguments of the last 4 chapters. Third, and finally, there is the question of the logical status of the respect principle. That principle certainly is more basic than the harm principle, the Minoride principle, or the worse-off principle, since these latter principles are derivable from it, not vice versa. By itself, however, this does not establish that the respect principle cannot be derived from some other, more fundamental principle, and it is difficult to say how this could be proven one way or the other. One does not show that a principle cannot be derived because it has not been. Though the rights view regards the respect principle as fundamental, it is prepared to leave the question of its possible derivation open, insisting only that a. No ethical theory can be adequate that fails to include the respect principle, and b. No consequentialist derivation of this principle is possible in principle. To attempt to derive the respect principle by appealing to the optimal consequences that would result from its acceptance is neither more nor less intelligent than attempting to derive the second law of thermodynamics in a similar way. Just as the grounds for rational acceptance of this law are and must be kept distinct from considerations about the beneficial consequences that will or might flow from accepting it, so the grounds for rational acceptance of the respect principle, including its possible derivation from a still more fundamental principle, can only mistakenly be supposed to involve consequentialist considerations. 8.14 Summary and Conclusion. The principal conclusion reached in the present chapter is that all moral agents and patients have certain basic moral rights. To say that these individuals possess basic or unacquired moral rights means that 1. They possess certain rights independently of anyone's voluntary acts, either their own or those of others, and independently of the position they happen to occupy in any given institutional arrangement. 2. These rights are universal. That is, they are possessed by all relevantly similar individuals, independently of those considerations mentioned in 1. And 3. All who possess these rights possess them equally. Basic moral rights thus differ both from acquired moral rights, for example, the right of the promisee against the promissor, because one acquires these rights as a result of someone's voluntary acts or one's place in an institutional arrangement, and from legal rights, for example, the right to vote, since legal rights, unlike basic moral rights, are not equal or universal. Moral rights, whether basic or acquired, were analyzed as valid claims. To make a claim is to affirm that certain treatment is owed or is due, either to oneself or to another or others. A claim is valid if and only if a. It is a valid claim against assignable individuals, and b. It is a valid claim to treatment owed by these individuals, the validity of any claim to resting ultimately on the validity of principles of direct duty. Because the primary concern of the present chapter was the question of basic moral rights, major emphasis was placed on validating rights of this kind. The principal basic moral right possessed by all moral agents and patients is the right to respectful treatment. For reasons offered in Chapter 7, all moral agents and patients are intelligibly and non-arbitrarily viewed as having a distinctive kind of value, inherent value, and as having this value equally. All moral agents and patients must always be treated in ways that are consistent with the recognition of their equal possession of value of this kind. These individuals have a basic moral right to respectful treatment because the claim made to it is A, a valid claim against assignable individuals, namely all moral agents, and B, a valid claim to, the validity of the claim to resting on appeal to the respect principle, the case for that principle's validity having been made in an earlier context. The basic moral right to respectful treatment prohibits treating moral agents or patients as if they were mere receptacles of intrinsic values, for example, pleasure, lacking any value of their own, since such a view of these individuals would allow harming some, for example by making them suffer, on the grounds that the aggregate consequences for all those other receptacles affected by the outcome would be the best. It was also argued that all moral agents and patients have a prima facie, basic moral right not to be harmed. To say that this latter right is a prima facie right means that 1. There are circumstances in which it is permissible to override it, but 2. Anyone who would override it must justify doing so by appeal to valid moral principles that can be shown to override this right in a given case. 2 challenges to regarding this right as prima facie. First, the view that we ought never to use harmful violence, the pacifist principle, and second, the view that we ought never to harm the innocent, the innocence principle, were considered and shown to be deficient, and 2 moral principles, the Minoride and the worse-off principles, were identified as valid principles, derivable from the respect principle, that can justify overriding the right of the innocent not to be harmed. The Minoride principle implies that, special considerations aside, numbers count. When we are faced with choosing between harming the few who are innocent or harming the many, and when all those who will be harmed face prima facie comparable harm, then we ought to choose to override the rights of the few. The worse-off principle implies that, special considerations aside, numbers don't count. Special considerations aside, when we are faced with choosing to harm the many or the few who are innocent, and when the harm faced by the few would make them worse off than any of the many, then we ought to override the rights of the many rather than the few. The worse-off principle also applies to cases where only 2 individuals are involved, as was illustrated. Both the Minoride and worse-off principles are logically distinct from, and should not be confused with, the minimize harm principle, the principle that we are to act so as to minimize the aggregate amount of harm done to all those affected by the outcome, including all the side effects. The rights view rejects such an aggregative principle as a basis for overriding individual rights, since all such principles assume that moral agents and patients are mere receptacles of value. For similar reasons, therefore, the rights view rejects, and at the same time provides an option to, utilitarian approaches to deciding when, and if so, why the innocent may be justifiably harmed. Various objections were considered, ranging from those that challenge the analysis of rights as valid claims, to those that assert that the rights view has implications that are at odds with our considered beliefs. Though not all the objections the rights view must face have or could be considered, those that were addressed are among the most important. To have shown that they fail to mount a serious attack on that view is to have gone some distance toward the goal of providing it with an adequate defense. Thus has the case for animal rights been offered. If it is sound, then, like us, animals have certain basic moral rights, including, in particular, the fundamental right to be treated with the respect that, as possessors of inherent value, they are due as a matter of strict justice. Like us, therefore, assuming the soundness of the arguments that have gone before, they must never be treated as mere receptacles of intrinsic values, for example, pleasure or preference satisfaction, and any harm that is done to them must be consistent with the recognition of their equal inherent value and their equal prima facie right not to be harmed. It remains to be asked whether our institutions or practices give animals the justice they are due. That is the central issue explored in the next and final chapter.